Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the walls of Victorian houses, where behind the elaborate wallpaper and beneath the polished floorboards, women hid entire lives, lives their husbands never knew about, lives that society would have destroyed them for living. Picture this, a respectable lady in 1875 London, corset laced tight, hair perfectly pinned, smiling at afternoon tea. But the moment she closes her bedroom door, she slides open a secret panel, pulls out a locked diary, and writes words that could ruin her forever. Why did these women need to hide? What were they so desperate to keep secret? And what can their hidden rooms teach us about the price of freedom? Before we step through those concealed doors together, I want to ask you something. If this story intrigues you, if you are curious about the secrets hiding in history, take just a second to subscribe to this channel and tap that like button. But only if you genuinely want to join me on these journeys through time. I am not here to trick you into clicking. I am here because I love these stories, and I think you might too. So go ahead, hit subscribe if you want more of this. And tell me, where are you right now? Are you in bed half asleep? Sitting in a quiet room with rain outside? I would love to know. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. Now dim those lights if you can, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle white noise, get comfortable, and let us walk together into the Victorian era, where the most beautiful homes held the darkest secrets. You know, when we think about Victorian houses today, we imagine those gorgeous painted ladies in San Francisco or those sprawling Gothic mansions in London with their bay windows and intricate trim. We think elegance, we think propriety, we think of everything being proper and out in the open, right? But here is the thing about the Victorians that most people do not realize. They were absolutely obsessed with secrets. The more respectable you appeared on the outside, the more you needed to hide on the inside. It was like, imagine if your Instagram feed had to be perfect, but your real life was chaos. Except instead of just deleting photos, you built actual secret rooms in your house. And I am not talking about a little hidden drawer in a desk. I am talking about entire staircases that disappeared behind bookshelves. Rooms that had no doors, or rather, doors that looked like walls, passages that connected bedrooms in ways the architect's official plans never showed. The Victorians turned their homes into architectural puzzles, and women were often the ones who needed these puzzles most. Let me take you to London, 1870. You are standing in front of a massive Victorian mansion, 7,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, 2 reception rooms, a study. Everything is symmetrical, orderly, exactly as it should be. The house practically screams respectability. You walk through the front door and everything is exactly what you would expect. Dark wood paneling, heavy curtains, portraits of stern ancestors staring down at you. But then you notice something odd. The wall in the drawing room sounds hollow when you tap it. There is a faint draft coming from what should be solid wood. You press on a carved rose in the panelling and click. The entire section of wall swings inward, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward into darkness. This is not fiction. This is a real house. And when renovators finally explored that hidden staircase in 2014, do you know what they found? A tiny room, maybe 8 by 10 feet, tucked under the eaves. Inside was a cracked porcelain teacup, a tattered book, an old oil lamp, and on the wall, beneath layers of dust, faded floral wallpaper that had not seen daylight in decades. Whose room was this? Why was it sealed away? Nobody knows for certain, but we can guess. Because this was not the only house like this. Not even close. See, the Victorians had this whole philosophy about architecture. They believed that your house should reflect your moral character. If you were a good person, your house should show it. Everything had to be in its proper place. Men had their libraries and billiard rooms and studies, serious rooms for serious business. Women had their morning rooms and drawing rooms and parlours, decorative spaces for decorative purposes. Everyone had their assigned spot. Everything was controlled. Everything was visible, except it was not. Because alongside all those official rooms, there were the unofficial ones. The ones that did not appear on any floor plan. The servant staircases, sure, but also other things. Secret doors, hidden compartments, rooms that technically did not exist. Now you might be thinking, okay, maybe rich people just liked having secret passageways because it is cool, like a Victorian version of a Batman cave, and sure, there was probably some of that. But here is what makes it fascinating. These secret spaces were not evenly distributed. They were not random. When you actually study Victorian architecture, you start to notice a pattern. The most elaborate hidden spaces, the most carefully concealed rooms, they were almost always connected to women's quarters, the boudoir, the dressing room, the bedroom. Why? Because women needed them. Let me paint you a picture of what it meant to be a respectable Victorian woman. Your entire life was performance. From the moment you woke up until the moment you went to sleep, you were on stage. You could not show anger. You could not show ambition. You could not show intellectual curiosity beyond what was considered feminine and decorative. You were supposed to be an angel, pure, pious, submissive, domestic. That was the ideal. The cult of true womanhood, they called it. And if you failed to live up to that ideal, society could destroy you. Not metaphorically, actually destroy you. Your reputation gone, your marriage potentially annulled, your children taken away, in extreme cases, locked in an asylum. Yes, really, women were institutionalized for things like reading too much or overaction of the mind. We will get to that horror in a later chapter, but for now just understand this. The stakes were incredibly high. So what did women do? They built double lives, public angels, private human beings, and the architecture of their homes made that possible. Think about it like this. Imagine you are a Victorian wife. Your husband controls all the money. He can read your mail if he wants to, or he can go through your belongings. Privacy, as we understand it today, basically does not exist for you legally. But physically you can create it. A desk with a secret drawer, a panel in the wall that opens to reveal a hidden shelf, a room that nobody else knows about. Suddenly you have space, not much, but enough to keep a diary your husband cannot read, enough to hide letters from a friend he does not approve of, enough to store money you have secretly saved, enough to keep a book that would be considered scandalous, enough to just breathe. Winchester Mystery House in California is probably the most famous example of a Victorian house with secret passages, and yeah, the story is wild. Sarah Winchester, widow of the gun manufacturer, supposedly built it to confuse ghosts. Staircases that go nowhere, doors that open onto walls, 450 doorways, but some of them lead to nothing. Now, was Sarah Winchester actually trying to confuse spirits? Or was she a wealthy widow who wanted to build whatever she wanted without anyone telling her no? Hard to say. Maybe both. But here is what I find interesting. People always focus on the weirdness of the Winchester house, the spooky ghost story. But nobody really talks about how it was a house designed and controlled entirely by a woman. In an era when women were not even supposed to handle their own finances, Sarah Winchester was employing construction workers 24 hours a day, building a mansion according to her vision. The secret passages were not a bug. They were a feature. They were her space, her control, her mystery, or take Kerner's Folly in North Carolina. built in the 1880s by an interior designer named Euler Kerner. 22 rooms on 7 levels, 15 fireplaces, all different. Secret passageways, hidden doors, rooms tucked away where you would never expect them. Now, Kerner was a man, but he designed houses for wealthy families, which meant he understood what his clients wanted. And what they wanted was complexity, layers, the ability to move through the house unseen if necessary, because in Victorian society, seeing and being seen was everything. And sometimes you did not want to be seen. But the most telling examples are not the famous mansions, they are the ordinary houses. The middle-class homes where women were not building architectural follies for fun. They were creating hiding spots out of necessity. A false bottom in a hat box, a hollowed-out book, a loose floorboard in the bedroom. These were not games, these were survival strategies. Because the Victorian era had this sassive contradiction at its heart. On one hand, they were obsessed with privacy. Your home was your castle, your bedroom was sacred. On the other hand, women had basically no privacy. Your husband could legally demand access to anything you owned, including your thoughts if you were foolish enough to write them down. So what did women do? They got creative. They built their own privacy, one secret panel at a time. And here is the thing that really gets me about all this. The Victorians were incredible engineers. They could build bridges that still stand today. They could design railway systems that revolutionized transportation. They had the technical skill to create almost anything. But instead of using that skill to give women freedom, they used it to create the illusion of control, while women secretly carved out actual freedom in the spaces between the walls. It is like the whole society was playing this elaborate game of pretend and everyone knew it, but nobody could say it out loud. The hidden rooms tell us something that all the official histories miss. They tell us that Victorian women were not the passive, obedient angels that the era wanted them to be. They were human beings with desires and thoughts and secrets and plans. And when society would not give them space to be human, they built that space themselves, sometimes literally, with hammers and nails and hidden hinges, other times metaphorically, with coded diaries and cross-written letters and carefully maintained double lives, but always they found a way. So when you see a beautiful Victorian house today, all restored and perfect, ask yourself this: what is behind those walls? What secrets are still sealed away? Because for every hidden room we have found, there are probably 10 more we have not. And every single one has a story. A woman who needed space, who needed silence, who needed somewhere she could be herself, even if just for a few minutes, before putting the mask back on and returning to the performance. The architecture was never just about beauty, it was about survival. And the women who lived in those houses, they were architects too, in their own way, building invisible rooms inside visible ones, creating sanctuaries in the spaces society overlooked. And their blueprints were written in silence, sealed behind walls, waiting for us to find them. Now we've talked about the physical spaces, the hidden doors and secret staircases, but there was one room in particular that was supposed to be a woman's sanctuary, her official private space. It had a name, the Boudoir. And what happened in that room, what it meant, and why it was both a refuge and a kind of beautiful cage, that is where our story goes next. Because if you think the hidden staircases were fascinating, wait until you hear about the one room where a Victorian woman was actually allowed to close the door. The question is, who was she keeping out, and what was she keeping in? The word boudoir sounds romantic, does it not? Almost seductive, like velvet curtains and silk cushions and secrets whispered in candlelight. And in a way, that is exactly what it was. But here is what most people do not realize. The word boudoir comes from the French verb bouder, which means to sulk, to pout, to withdraw in displeasure. So this supposedly romantic room, this feminine sanctuary, was literally named the sulking room. Think about that for a second. A woman's only private space in the entire house was called the place where she goes to sulk. Not to think, not to create, not to be herself, to sulk like a child being sent to her room. That tells you everything you need to know about how the Victorians viewed women's inner lives. But here is the beautiful irony. What started as a dismissive name for a woman's retreat became something so much more powerful than anyone intended. The boudoir became a room with its own rules, a space where for just a few hours a woman could loosen her corset, let down her hair, and exist without performing, and that was revolutionary. Let me take you to France first, because that is where the boudoir was born long before Queen Victoria ever sat on the throne. Paris, 1750. Imagine the palace of Madame de Pompadour, mistress to King Louis XV and possibly the most influential woman in France. Her boudoir was not hidden away in shame, it was celebrated. Lacquered ceilings, silk wallpaper, furniture so delicate it looked like it might float away. And it was not just pretty, it was brilliant. Madame de Pompadour conducted business in her boudoir. She met with artists, philosophers, politicians. She made decisions that shaped France, all from a room that was supposedly just for putting on makeup and sulking. The French understood something the Victorians tried very hard to forget. A woman's private space could be a centre of power. Or take Émilie du Châtelet, a French mathematician and physicist who translated Newton's work and conducted groundbreaking research in the 1730s. She fitted her boudoir at Château de Cirey, with scholarly furnishings, books, scientific instruments. Her boudoir was essentially a laboratory, a library, a place where she could be a scientist without society clutching its pearls. And she needed that space because, well, women were not supposed to be scientists. They were not supposed to understand mathematics. They were supposed to be decorative. So she built a room where the rules did not apply, where she could think dangerous thoughts and write equations that would outlive her. Now, fast forward to Victorian England. Same room, completely different vibe. The French boudoir was unapologetically sensual, intellectual, powerful. The Victorian boudoir was complicated. On the surface, it was supposed to be practical, a dressing room, a place where a lady could bathe, fix her hair, put on her many, many layers of clothing without anyone seeing the awkward bits. But underneath that practical purpose was something deeper, something they could not quite say out loud. Victorian women needed the boudoir not for sensuality, but for psychology, for sanity. Lady Barker wrote a whole book in 1878 called The Bedroom and Boudoir, and in it she describes the boudoir as a lovely nest and a place to idle and sulk in. Notice that word again, sulk. Even when they're trying to be nice about it, they cannot help but infantilize women. But then she says something interesting. She calls it a space for the purely psychological needs of women. Psychological needs. In an era when psychology barely existed as a science, when women's emotions were dismissed as hysteria, Lady Barker accidentally admitted something crucial. Women needed mental space, emotional space, and a room of their own, if you will. Virginia Woolf would write about this idea decades later, but Victorian women were already living it. So what did a Victorian boudoir actually look like? Well, it depended on how wealthy you were, but there were some common elements. First, the chaise lounge. This was essential. A piece of furniture that was half chair, half bed, perfect for reading, writing letters, or just lying down when your corset was crushing your ribcage and you needed to breathe for 5 minutes. Then the writing desk, usually positioned near a window for natural light, and on that desk, an assemblage of beautiful objects, jewellery boxes, letter writing supplies, and very often a lock, locked drawers, locked compartments, locked diaries. The Victorians were obsessed with locks. They sold thousands of lockable diaries every year. And this is fascinating because, according to historian Sharon Marcus, locked diaries were actually quite uncommon earlier in the century. Most people kept diaries as the sort of public record, something they fully expected family members to read. But as the Victorian era progressed, something shifted. Women started wanting privacy, real privacy, not just a closed door but a locked one. And when society pushed back, when husbands and fathers said, "Why do you need to lock your diary? What are you hiding?" women lock them anyway. The fact that a lock existed meant something was worth protecting, and what they were protecting was themselves. The furniture in a boudoir told a story too. Everything was chosen to be comfortable, but also beautiful. Upholstered chairs with ornate designs, sometimes Rococo style, all curves and flowers, sometimes chinoiserie, with Asian-inspired patterns that hinted at exotic, faraway places. Because here is the thing, the boudoir was a fantasy space, not in a silly way, but in a necessary way. If your real life was suffocating, you could at least surround yourself with beauty. You could create a room that felt different from the rest of the house, a room that was yours. Fireplaces were central too. This was before modern heating, remember, so if you wanted to be warm, you needed a fire. And there were special chairs designed just for sitting by the fire. Fireside chairs. You could curl up with a book, watch the flames, and for a little while forget about all the expectations pressing down on you from every direction. Does that sound dramatic? Maybe. But consider this. A Victorian woman of the middle or upper class was expected to attend endless social functions. Dinners, teas, balls, garden parties, and at every single one she was being watched, judged, evaluated on her appearance, her manners, her conversation. One wrong word could start rumours. One inappropriate laugh could damage her reputation. The social performance was exhausting, so the boudoir became the place where the performance could stop, where the mask could come off. Now, here is where it gets interesting. The Victorian boudoir was not supposed to be sexual at all. The Victorians were deeply uncomfortable with female sexuality. Officially, respectable women were not even supposed to enjoy sex. It was a duty, not a pleasure. So the boudoir had to be carefully positioned as something pure, something maternal and domestic, but come on. A private room often connected directly to the bedroom where a woman could control who entered, where she could lounge around in her dressing gown, where the decor was soft and sensual and focused entirely on her comfort. The Victorians could pretend it was not about sexuality, but the room itself told a different story. And very quietly, very discreetly, some women used their boudoirs exactly how the French had used them. For intimacy, for romance, for moments stolen away from the rigid rules of society. There is a reason boudoir photography became a thing in the late 1800s. Women posing in their private rooms in their undergarments, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was definitely not pure and definitely not maternal. These photographs were considered scandalous, obviously, but they existed, which means women were claiming their sensuality, even when they were not supposed to have any. Marie Antoinette's boudoir at Château de Bellevue featured a Turkish-style bedroom with turbaned figures and crescent moons painted on the walls. The whole room was designed to evoke the exotic, the sensual, the forbidden. And while Victorian women could not exactly redecorate in quite such a bold style, they could add small touches. A painting that was a little too romantic, a novel that was a little too scandalous hidden in a drawer, a silk dressing gown in a colour that was not quite respectable. Small rebellions, but rebellions nonetheless. The boudoir also became a social space, which is something people do not always realise. Yes, it was private, but it was not always solitary. Women would invite close friends into their boudoirs, female friends, and there, behind a closed door, they could talk freely about their marriages, about their frustrations, about their dreams, about books they were reading or ideas they were having. The boudoir became a salon in miniature, a place where women could have the intellectual conversations that were discouraged in mixed company. Because in the parlour, in the drawing room, women were expected to make pleasant small talk, to defer to men's opinions, to be charming but not too clever. But in the boudoir, they could be as clever as they wanted. Think about the Bronte sisters for a moment. Charlotte, Emily and Anne living in a parsonage in Yorkshire, writing novels that would change literature forever. Where do you think they wrote? Not in the family sitting room where their father and brother could see. They wrote in their bedrooms, in private spaces where they could explore dark themes and passionate emotions and female anger without anyone telling them to stop. Emily kept her diary papers in a tin box that was originally meant for sewing supplies, a literal hidden compartment for her hidden thoughts. That is boudoir logic applied to creative work. You need privacy to think thoughts that society finds uncomfortable. So you create that privacy, even if it is just a locked box under your bed. But here is the tragedy woven into all of this. The boudoir was a sanctuary, yes, but it was also a cage, because the very fact that women needed a special room, a designated space where they were allowed to have feelings and thoughts, that tells you how restricted they were everywhere else. Men did not need boudoir. Men had entire houses. They had clubs. They had offices. They had the world. Women had one room, and even that room was subject to invasion. A husband could enter whenever he wanted. Servants came and went. Privacy was never guaranteed. It was always conditional, always at risk. And if a woman tried to claim too much privacy, if she locked a door too often, if she seemed to be hiding something, that could be dangerous, because in Victorian society, a woman who wanted too much privacy was suspicious. What was she doing in there? Who was she writing to? What was she reading? Privacy for women was always a little bit scandalous, a little bit transgressive, even in the room that was supposedly designed for it. Yet despite all of that, the boudoir survived. It evolved. It became this strange hybrid space where Victorian morality and female autonomy were constantly negotiating, where the official purpose was innocent, but the actual use could be revolutionary, where a woman could be exactly who she was told to be, and also someone entirely different, depending on who was watching. So when you hear the word boudoir now, I want you to think about all of that complexity. Yes, it was beautiful. Yes, it was feminine, but it was also political. It was psychological. It was necessary. It was a room where women went to sulk, sure, but also to think, to write, to breathe, to exist as full human beings instead of decorative objects. And that is not romantic. That is survival. The boudoir was never just about pretty furniture and silk curtains. It was about carving out space in a world that did not want to give you any. It was about creating privacy in a society that believed women did not deserve it. And it was about the quiet, persistent refusal to be nothing but an angel. Even if that refusal had to happen behind a locked door in a room named after pouting, because sometimes a locked door is the most radical thing you can have. We have talked about the physical space, the boudoir as a room, but what women did in those rooms, what they wrote and thought and dreamed, that is a whole other layer of this story. Because Victorian women had inner lives that were rich and complex and often dangerous to express, so they found ways to express them anyway. In diaries that they locked, in letters that they hid, in words that they wrote in code. And those written secrets, they reveal a truth that the Victorians desperately wanted to keep hidden, that women were never the angels society pretended they were. They were human, messy, passionate, angry, brilliant, and they wrote it all down even when writing it down could destroy them. Picture a woman in 1850 sitting at her writing desk as afternoon light filters through lace curtains. She dips her pen in ink, opens her leather-bound diary and pauses. What she is about to write could ruin her life. Not someday, not theoretically. Actually ruin it. Her marriage could end. Her children could be taken away. She could be declared insane and locked in an asylum. All because of words on a page. And yet, she writes anyway. She writes because she has to. Because the thoughts in her head are so loud, so insistent, that keeping them locked inside feels like drowning. So she writes, and then she locks the diary and she hides the key and she prays that no one ever finds it. This is the secret double life of Victorian women, not the one happening in hidden rooms and secret passages, the one happening in diaries and letters, the one written in ink and sealed with wax and buried in locked drawers. Because here is what nobody tells you about the Victorian era. It was the golden age of women's writing, not published writing, not yet, though that was coming, but private writing, confessional writing, dangerous writing. Women were documenting their lives in unprecedented numbers, and what they documented was, well, it was everything the Victorians pretended did not exist. The diary itself was a fairly new invention as a personal, private thing. Earlier generations kept diaries, sure, but those were often meant to be read by others. A record of daily activities, a chronicle of events, something you might share with family or even publish after your death. But in the Victorian era, something shifted. People started writing diaries that were meant for their eyes only. Locked diaries became available for purchase in the 1850s, and they sold by the thousands. Women bought them eagerly. And the very existence of a lock on a diary tells you something important. There were secrets inside that needed protecting. Let me tell you about a woman named Ethel Smith, born in 1858. When she was a child, she started keeping a secret diary, and her family was scandalized. Not by what she wrote. They never read it, but by the fact that she locked it. Her elders disapproved so strongly that 60 years later, she still remembered their reaction. Think about that. A little girl wanting privacy for her thoughts was considered wrong, inappropriate, suspicious, because in Victorian society, even your thoughts were not entirely your own, especially if you were female. But women kept writing anyway. They wrote in diaries that they hid under their mattresses. They wrote in journals that they locked with tiny keys they wore around their necks. They wrote in the margins of books, in the blank spaces of household ledgers, on scraps of paper that they could destroy quickly if necessary. They wrote because what else could they do? When you cannot speak your truth out loud, you write it down, even if no one else will ever read it. Even if you have to burn it later. The act of writing it makes it real, makes you real. Queen Victoria herself kept a diary for most of her life. 122 volumes. Can you imagine? She started when she was 13 with a diary her mother gave her, and she wrote in it almost every day until she died in 1901. Now, Victoria's diaries are interesting because she was the queen, right? She could write whatever she wanted. Nobody could stop her. And what she chose to write was surprisingly human. She wrote about being in love with Prince Albert, and not in some distant proper way. She described his beautiful figure and his fine waist. She wrote about how handsome he looked in his white cashmere breeches with nothing on underneath. Yes, the Queen of England wrote that down, in her diary. The woman who gave her name to an entire era of supposed sexual repression was documenting her attraction to her husband in very, very specific terms. And that tells you something crucial about Victorian women. They were not actually repressed, not internally. They were forced to repress themselves publicly, but privately, in their diaries, they felt everything. They wanted everything, they just could not say it out loud. So they wrote it down and locked it away. But Queen Victoria had power and privilege that most women did not have. Her diaries were private, but they were also safe. Nobody was going to use them against her. For ordinary women, though, a diary was evidence, a weapon someone could use to destroy you. And sometimes they did. Let me introduce you to Isabella Robinson, a 41-year-old housewife in 1858 London, married to a man named Henry Robinson, who was, by all accounts, terrible, cold, controlling, unfaithful. He had secretly fathered 2 children with his mistress. Isabella knew about this. She lived with it. She had no choice. Divorce was nearly impossible for women. So she stayed in her miserable marriage, and she tried to find moments of happiness where she could. She became friends with the family doctor named Edward Lane, 10 years younger than her, kind and interesting, someone she could actually talk to, and she fell in love with him, not in a scandalous affair kind of way, just emotionally. She loved being around him, she loved the conversations they had, she loved the way he made her feel seen. And she wrote about all of this in her diary, every feeling, every longing, every moment of connection and frustration. She poured her heart onto those pages because she had nowhere else to put it. The diary was her sanctuary, her therapist, her friend, until one day her husband found it. He read it, and he decided to destroy her with it. Henry Robinson sued for divorce, claiming adultery. He had no proof that Isabella and Dr. Lane had ever done anything physical, but he had the diary, and in that diary Isabella had written about her feelings in vivid, passionate detail. The diary was read aloud in court, in public. Her most private thoughts, the things she never meant anyone to see, exposed for everyone to judge. The prosecution called the diary proof of extravagance, excitement, and irritability, bordering on, if not actually in, the domain of madness. They said it showed so flighty, extravagant, excitable, romantic, irritable, foolish, and disordered a mind. In other words, she felt things, she had emotions, she wanted more from life, and therefore she must be crazy. Isabella won her case technically. The court decided there was no evidence of actual adultery, but winning felt like losing. She lost all her friends. Her reputation was destroyed. She was only able to keep her children and her financial allowance because she stayed married to a man who hated her. Her diary, the one place she had been free to be herself, had been turned into a courtroom spectacle, a cautionary tale, proof that women's inner lives were dangerous. Now you might be thinking, okay, so do not write incriminating things in your diary, problem solved. But here is the thing, in Victorian society, almost anything a woman felt could be considered incriminating. Ambition, inappropriate, anger at your husband, scandalous, intellectual curiosity, unwomanly, sexual desire, absolutely not. Even sadness could be dangerous. If you were too sad, you might be diagnosed with hysteria or melancholia and subjected to horrifying medical treatments. So what were you supposed to write about? The weather, how lovely the tea party was. Some women did write only safe, boring things, but others took the risk. They wrote the truth anyway. Anne Lister is one of my favourite examples of this. A wealthy woman from Yorkshire, born in 1791, living through the early Victorian era. Anne was a prolific writer. She kept detailed diaries her entire adult life, and in those diaries, she wrote about her relationships with women. Anna Lister was a lesbian, in a time when that word did not even exist yet. When same-sex relationships between women were so unthinkable that the law did not even bother to criminalize them, because surely women would never, except they did. Anne Lister did, and she wrote about it. But she was smart. She wrote parts of her diary in code, a cipher she developed based on Greek and algebra. The mundane stuff, what she ate for breakfast, who visited the house, that was irregular English. But the important stuff, the romantic and sexual parts, those were encrypted. She knew her diaries were dangerous, so she protected them the only way she could, with mathematics. There is a letter Anne wrote to a friend named Sibella, and even in a non-coded letter you can feel her trying to express something that society had no language for. She writes, "I am an enigma even to myself and do excite my own curiosity. Can you imagine being so aware that you do not fit the categories society has created, that you become a mystery to yourself?" But here is the beautiful part. Sibella seems to have accepted Anne's sexuality. Anne felt safe enough to reveal this part of herself to her friend without fear of rejection, which means that even in the midst of all that repression, there were pockets of understanding, moments of acceptance, quiet rebellions happening in letter after letter. Anne also used a technique that was common in the Victorian era to save money on postage. It is called cross-writing. You would write your letter normally on a page, filling it from top to bottom, but then, instead of getting a second page, which would cost more to mail, you would turn the paper 90 degrees and write across the lines you had already written. Sometimes people did this 2 or 3 times, creating this incredibly complicated lattice of words going in multiple directions. It was hard to read, obviously. You had to turn the page and squint and really work to decipher it. But that difficulty was a feature, not a bug, because a cross-written letter was essentially private. Even if someone intercepted it, even if they tried to read it, it was so complicated that most people would just give up. For queer people in the Victorian era, when the Buggery Act of 1533 was still in effect and you could be imprisoned or even hanged for same-sex relationships, cross-written letters were a lifeline, a way to communicate safely. Anne Lister used them whenever she was writing about something with queer implications, an extra layer of protection on top of her cipher. The Bronte sisters, who we talked about earlier, also kept diaries, but theirs were collaborative. Emily and Anne wrote diary papers together, starting in 1834 when they were teenagers. These were not daily entries. They were little snapshots of life, written every few years. In the first one, they talk about feeding their pets. They mention the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. They describe their aunt scolding Anne for not having her feet on the floor, their sister Charlotte peeling apples to make pudding. It sounds so ordinary, right? Just 2 sisters documenting a normal day, but this was a little doodle of a lock of hair that Anne drew, and the handwriting is messy, private, clearly not meant for public eyes. These diary papers were their secret project, their way of creating a shared private world that nobody else could enter. And both Emily and Anne used their experiences with diaries in their novels. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine Earnshaw writes in the margins of books, including her Bible. For Catherine, diary writing is an escape, a way to preserve herself in a world that is trying to erase her. In The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Anne Bronte uses diary structure as the backbone of the entire novel. The main character, Helen, is trapped in an abusive marriage, and her diary is the only place she can tell the truth about it. At a crucial moment in the story, Helen gives her diary to Gilbert, the man she loves, so he can understand what she has been through. The diary becomes a bridge, a way of communicating things that are too painful or too dangerous to say out loud. Charlotte Bronte kept a teaching journal, and her entries are heartbreaking. She hated teaching, found it suffocating. She writes about how she would be in the middle of a lesson, and her mind would escape to Angria, the imaginary world she and her brother Branwell had created. She writes, "All this day I've been in a dream, half miserable and half ecstatic. Miserable because I could not follow it out uninterruptedly, ecstatic because it showed almost in the vivid light of reality the ongoings of the infernal world. Can you feel the frustration in that? The sense of having a rich inner life that she cannot access because she is stuck doing work she despises. The journal was the only place she could admit that, the only place she could be honest about the gap between who she was supposed to be and who she actually was. So many Victorian women lived in that gap, the space between expectation and reality, between performance and truth, and the diary was where they documented that gap, where they named it, where they tried to make sense of it. But it was always risky, always vulnerable, because at any moment someone could find the diary, read it, use it against you. The very act of writing down your truth was an act of rebellion, and rebellion in the Victorian era could cost you everything. Yet they did it anyway. Thousands of women writing in thousands of locked books, documenting thousands of secret lives. Some of those diaries survived, most did not. They were burned by their authors when they got too dangerous. They were destroyed by family members after the woman died to protect her reputation. They were lost to time, but the ones that remain, they are extraordinary. They show us women who were intelligent, passionate, complicated, angry, loving, ambitious, sexual, creative, fully human. Everything the Victorian era insisted women were not. The written word gave Victorian women something powerful. It gave them a witness. Even if that witness was just themselves reading their own words years later. Even if nobody else ever saw it. They existed on those pages in a way they could not exist anywhere else. And that mattered. It still matters. Because every diary, every letter, every secret page is proof that women were never the angels society wanted them to be. Proof that they had inner lives society tried to deny. Proof that they resisted, even when resistance had to be silent. Even when it had to be written in code and locked away and hidden in the walls. Now, we have been talking about women creating their own sanctuaries, carving out spaces, whether physical or written, where they could exist outside society's rules. But there is another side to this story, a darker side, because the Victorian era did not just create private sanctuaries for women, it also created public ones. Places that were supposed to offer refuge, supposed to provide safety, but often became prisons instead. And the line between sanctuary and imprisonment, that line was thinner than you might think. In fact, sometimes it did not exist at all. There is a word that has changed meaning so dramatically over time that it almost feels like a different word entirely. Asylum. Loud. What do you feel? Probably something dark, right? Something frightening. Images of padded cells and straitjackets and people screaming behind locked doors. But here is the thing that will break your heart. The word asylum originally meant sanctuary, safety, refuge, a place where you could go to escape danger, a place of protection. So how did a word that meant safety become synonymous with imprisonment? And more importantly, why were so many Victorian women caught in that transformation? Let me take you back to the beginning, the 18th century, before the Victorian era even started. Mental illness was not well understood, obviously, but society was starting to realise that locking people up in prisons alongside criminals was probably not the solution. So reformers started calling for something different, asylums. Places specifically designed to care for people with mental health conditions, and the early asylums, the ones built with genuine compassion, were actually kind of revolutionary. In 1796, a man named William Tuke founded the York Retreat in England, and it was based on a radical idea. What if we treated mentally ill people like human beings? What if instead of chains and punishment, We offered them dignity and kindness. The York retreat had no manacles, no physical punishment. Treatment focused on personal attention and benevolence. The goal was to restore self-esteem and self-control. Patients were called guests, not prisoners. They had gardens to walk in, activities to engage with, a daily routine that gave structure without cruelty. It was designed to hold about 30 patients, small enough that everyone could receive individual care. His son Samuel Tuke wrote a book about it called A Description of the Retreat, and it became hugely influential. This approach was called moral treatment, and it spread. Other asylums started adopting similar principles. The idea was that mental illness was not a moral failing or a punishment from God, it was a medical condition, and medical conditions could be treated with compassion and structure and hope. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like society was moving towards something better. But then, something happened. Population growth, industrialization, cities getting bigger and more complicated. And suddenly, there were more people who needed care than the small, compassionate asylums could handle. So governments started building bigger institutions, county asylums, state hospitals, places designed to hold hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients. And when you scale something up that much, when you turn individual care into mass management, things change. The ideals remain on paper, but the reality becomes something else entirely. By the mid-1800s, the Victorian era in full swing, asylums were facing a crisis. They were overcrowded, underfunded, understaffed. Facilities that were designed for 100 patients were holding 300. Rooms that should have had 10 beds had 30, packed so close together that you could barely walk between them. Fresh air therapy and personal attention became impossible. Superintendents who wanted to maintain the moral treatment approach simply could not. There were not enough hours in the day, not enough staff, not enough resources, so they resorted to the old methods: restraints, padded cells, sedation, isolation. The very things the reformers had fought against came flooding back. And here is where women enter the story in a particularly horrific way. Because asylums were not just for people with genuine mental illness. They were also for people that society found inconvenient. And in Victorian society, the most inconvenient people were often women who did not conform. Let me show you something. There is a poster from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in the United States, and it lists reasons why patients were admitted. Some of them are heartbreaking but understandable. Death of sons in war, desertion of husband, domestic trouble, depression from genuine trauma, but then there are others. Novel reading, imaginary female trouble, egotism, religious enthusiasm, overaction of the mind, and my personal favourite, fell from horse in war. Wait, that last one is actually legitimate. But novel reading, overaction of the mind, those are reasons to lock someone up. Women were institutionalized for wanting to educate themselves, for reading too much, for having opinions, for refusing to marry the man their father chose, for being too sad after a miscarriage, for being too happy when their husband thought they should be somber, for expressing any emotion that did not fit the narrow definition of appropriate femininity. And once you were inside an asylum, getting out was difficult, sometimes impossible. The admission process was shockingly easy. In many cases, all it took was 2 doctors and a male relative. Your husband could claim you were hysterical. 2 doctors would agree, often without extensive examination. And suddenly you were committed. You had no legal recourse, no right to defend yourself. Women were not even allowed to testify in their own commitment hearings. Your voice did not matter. Your version of events did not matter. If the men in your life decided you were mad, you were mad. End of story. And the thing is, Some women probably were genuinely mentally ill and needed help. The Victorians did not have good treatments for depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or any number of legitimate conditions, but they also committed women who were not ill at all. Women who were just inconvenient, wives who knew about their husbands' affairs and threatened to make them public, daughters who refused arranged marriages, women who wanted control over their own money, women who were too smart, too ambitious, too angry, too anything. Let me tell you about Nellie Bly. She was a journalist in New York City, only 23 years old, and in 1887 she did something extraordinary. She went undercover in the Blackwell's Island Asylum. She faked symptoms of mental illness, got herself committed, and then spent 10 days documenting what actually happened inside. And what she found was nightmare fuel. Patients were forced to sit in silence for hours. They ate spoiled food. They had barely any heat in winter. The bathwater was ice cold. Patients were beaten by staff. Women who complained were isolated in even worse conditions. And many of the women Bly met were not mentally ill at all. They were immigrants who did not speak English. Women who had nowhere else to go. Women who had been committed by families who just wanted them gone. When Bly's articles were published, there was a huge scandal. A grand jury investigated. They found that yes, everything she described was true. The asylum had been warned about the inspection, so they cleaned up and brought in fresh food and tried to cover their tracks. But the jury still saw enough to be horrified. They recommended massive reforms. Nearly $1 million, which would be about $24 million today, was added to the mental health budget. Abusive staff were fired. Translators were hired for immigrant patients. The system for commitment was reformed to make it harder to institutionalize people who were not actually ill. But here is the thing. That was one asylum, one investigation. There were hundreds of asylums across America and Britain, and most of them were never investigated. Most of them continued operating exactly as they had been. Women continued to be committed for reasons that were not medical. They continued to be trapped in institutions that were supposed to be sanctuaries but had become prisons. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not all asylums were hellholes. Some genuinely tried to maintain the moral treatment approach. Some superintendents really cared about their patients and did everything they could with limited resources. The York Retreat continued to operate according to its founding principles. Some private asylums for wealthy patients offered quite good care, beautiful grounds, comfortable rooms, activities and entertainment. If you were rich and your family wanted to help you, an asylum could actually be a decent place. But here is the dark irony. The nicest asylums, the ones with gardens and music rooms and actual treatment, those were also the easiest to use as prisons for inconvenient women. Because from the outside it looked humane, it looked caring. If someone asked, "Why is your wife in an asylum?" you could say, "Oh, she is unwell. But do not worry, she is at a lovely facility. Very comfortable. She walks in the gardens every day." And everyone would nod sympathetically and think what a devoted husband you were, taking such good care of your poor, fragile wife. Meanwhile, that wife might be perfectly sane, just trapped, living in a beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. The diagnostic criteria for women were, let us say, flexible. The Victorians believed that women's reproductive organs were directly connected to their mental health. Seriously, they thought the uterus could cause madness. So if a woman was behaving in ways society found unacceptable, doctors would blame her uterus. And the treatment. Sometimes it was rest and fresh air, which was harmless if ineffective, but sometimes it was surgery. Hysterectomies performed on women who did not need them. Removal of ovaries. Procedures that were painful, dangerous, and left women permanently altered. all in the name of curing mental illness that was often not mental illness at all, just normal human emotion that society found threatening. There was this concept called hysteria that was applied to women constantly. The word itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, because of course it does. Hysteria could mean almost anything: anxiety, depression, anger, sexual desire or lack of it, fatigue, ambition. Basically, if you were a woman and you felt anything other than placid contentment, you could be diagnosed with hysteria, and the diagnosis was often a life sentence. Once you were labelled hysterical, everything you did was seen through that lens. If you protested your treatment, that was proof you were hysterical. If you stayed quiet, that was also proof. You could not win. Some women spent 20, 30, even 40 years in asylums, admitted for something minor and just forgotten. Their families moved on, stopped visiting, stopped paying, but the asylum kept them anyway, because where else would they go? These women grew old inside institutions, watching the world change through barred windows, never allowed to participate in it. Yet here is the complicated part. For some women, a very small number, the asylum actually was a sanctuary. If you were in an abusive marriage and had no legal way to escape, being declared mentally ill might be the only option. You could be institutionalized, and at least you would be away from the husband who was hurting you. You would have a roof over your head, food, safety from physical violence. Is that horrifying to think about? That being locked in an asylum was preferable to staying in your own home, but for some women it was the truth. There are records of women who voluntarily committed themselves, who walked into asylums and asked to stay, not because they were mentally ill, but because they had nowhere else to go. Widows with no money, women whose families had disowned them, women fleeing situations that were unbearable. The asylum became a refuge not because it was good, but because everything else was worse. And that tells you everything you need to know about the options available to Victorian women. The staff in asylums were interesting too. In many cases, especially in the better institutions, the staff were women, matrons, nurses, attendants, and some of them were kind. Some of them genuinely tried to make life better for the patients. They would bend rules, sneak in small comforts, listen to the women when nobody else would. But they were also part of the system. They had to enforce the rules even when the rules were cruel. They had to participate in treatments they knew were harmful, because if they refused, they would lose their jobs. And in Victorian society, a working woman could not afford to lose her job. So you had this strange dynamic. Women caring for women, both of them trapped in a system designed by men, both of them trying to survive within constraints that were suffocating. Sometimes they helped each other, sometimes they hurt each other. Most of the time they did both, because that's what happens when you put people in impossible situations. They do not become saints or monsters. They become complicated, human, trying to make the best of circumstances that should never have existed in the first place. The asylum system reveals something crucial about Victorian society. It shows how easily the language of care can be weaponized, how quickly protection becomes control, how a sanctuary can transform into a prison without anyone even noticing the shift, because everyone involved believed they were doing the right thing. The doctors thought they were treating illness. The families thought they were protecting their loved ones. The staff thought they were providing care. But the cumulative effect was women losing their freedom, their autonomy, their very selves, all in the name of helping them. And the asylums lasted. Long after the Victorian era ended, they continued. Some of them operated well into the 20th century. It was not until the 1960s and 70s that the large institutions started closing, and even then, the closure was often about cost-cutting rather than compassion. The legacy of the Victorian asylum system is still with us, the way we talk about mental health, the stigma that still clings to it, the fear of being seen as too emotional or too difficult or too much. All of that has roots in the Victorian belief that women's emotions were dangerous and needed to be contained. But here is what I want you to remember. For every woman who was trapped in an asylum unjustly, there were probably 10 others who avoided it through sheer luck or cleverness or compromise. Women who learned exactly how much they could express before crossing the line, who became experts at reading the room, at moderating their behaviour, at appearing just sane enough to stay free. That was its own kind of prison, was it not? The constant self-monitoring, the awareness that one wrong move could cost you everything, the knowledge that your emotions were not your own, but were instead evidence that could be used against you. The asylum system was one way Victorian society controlled women, but there were quieter methods too, more subtle, things that happened inside the home, behind closed doors, where nobody could see, things that women had to navigate every single day just to survive. And one of the most powerful tools society had for controlling women was also one of the most invisible. It was not locks on doors or commitments to institutions. It was something much simpler and much more insidious. It was the control of words, of stories, of knowledge itself. And that is where we are going next, because if you think the asylum system was dark, wait until you hear about what Victorian women were and were not allowed to read, and what they did when someone told them certain books were forbidden. Imagine being told that a book could ruin you, not metaphorically, actually ruin you, that reading certain words on certain pages could corrupt your soul, damage your mind, make you unfit for marriage and motherhood, that the wrong novel could turn you into something dangerous and uncontrollable. Sounds ridiculous, right? Like something from a dystopian future where knowledge is forbidden. Except, this was not science fiction. This was Victorian England. And for women, books were not just entertainment. They were contraband. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with reading. On one hand, literacy was spreading. Education was becoming more accessible. Reading was seen as a wholesome, improving activity, good for the mind and the character. But on the other hand, there was deep anxiety about what people, especially women, were reading, because books contain ideas, and ideas are dangerous. They make you question things, they show you possibilities you never imagined. They whisper that maybe, just maybe, the life you are living is not the only option. And for a society built on rigid roles and strict hierarchies, that kind of thinking was terrifying. So the Victorians did what they always did when they were scared. They created rules, they made lists, they decided which books were appropriate and which were scandalous, which were educational and which were corrupting. And unsurprisingly, the books deemed dangerous were often the ones women wanted to read most. Let me paint you a picture. You are a middle-class Victorian woman, educated, literate, intelligent. You have time during the day when your domestic duties are done. You could read, but what, the approved reading list for women, is limiting. Religious texts, obviously. Moral tales about virtuous women who suffer beautifully and are rewarded in heaven. Poetry as long as it is not too passionate. Travel narratives written by men. Educational books about nature or history, but nothing too complex. Nothing that would require serious intellectual engagement. Nothing that would make you think too hard about your own situation. And absolutely, positively, nothing French. Because French literature was considered the most dangerous of all. The French wrote about passion, about desire, about women who made their own choices, even bad ones. French novels acknowledged that women had inner lives, complex emotions, sexual feelings, and in Victorian England, that was practically pornography. In 1856, Gustave Flaubert published Madame Bovary in France. It is the story of a woman trapped in a boring marriage who has affairs and ultimately destroys herself. The book was immediately put on trial for obscenity. Flaubert was acquitted, but the scandal was enormous. And in England, the book was not officially banned, but it was not translated into English until much later because it was considered too scandalous, too dangerous. If respectable women read about Emma Bovary, they might start identifying with her. They might start thinking that their own boring marriages were insufficient. They might start wanting more, and we cannot have that, can we? But here is what the censors never understood. Forbidding something does not make people stop wanting it. It makes them want it more. Tell someone they cannot have something, and suddenly that's the only thing they want. So Victorian women developed an underground network for forbidden books. They borrowed them from each other in secret. They smuggled them into the house hidden in shopping parcels. They read them late at night by candlelight and hid them when they heard footsteps. They created hidden libraries in their homes, behind false panels and inside locked cabinets, because if you cannot buy a book openly, you build a secret room for it. Some Victorian houses had the bookshelves that were not really bookshelves. They were doors. You would pull on a fake book spine and the entire shelf would swing open, revealing a hidden space. Now, popular mythology says these were for secret affairs and scandalous assignations, and maybe sometimes they were. But you know what else was hidden in those spaces? Books, novels that were considered inappropriate, poetry that was too sensual, French literature, political writings, scientific texts about human biology, anything that fell outside the narrow range of acceptable reading material for women. The British Library has a collection called the Private Case. It was created in the Victorian era to store books that were considered too obscene for public viewing. Erotica, obviously, but also medical texts about sexuality and reproduction, books about birth control, literary works that dealt with adult themes. And here is the fascinating part. These books were not destroyed. They were preserved. Locked away, yes, but preserved. Because even the censors understood that these works had value. They just did not think women should have access to that value. One man, Henry Spencer Ashby, was a bibliographer who collected thousands of volumes of what the Victorians called pornography. When he died, he left his entire collection to the British Museum with one condition. They had to accept all of it, the erotic works along with the conventional materials. The museum wanted his collection of materials about Cervantes, the Spanish writer, so they agreed. But then they went through and destroyed 6 boxes of what they called offensive matter, which is of no value or interest. Cheaply produced Victorian erotica, mostly. The rest formed the core of the Private Case, hidden from readers for over a century. Only scholars with special permission could access it, and you can bet those scholars were mostly male. So what did women actually read in secret? Well, sensation novels were hugely popular. These were basically the thriller novels of the Victorian era. Stories with dramatic plots, mysterious deaths, secret identities, women who were not passive victims but active participants in the story. Wilkie Collins wrote The Woman in White in 1859, and it was a massive bestseller. It featured women who were drugged, imprisoned in asylums for inheritance schemes, fighting for their freedom. Sound familiar? The Victorians ate it up, but respectable people pretended they did not. Reading sensation novels was considered lowbrow, trashy, not suitable for refined ladies, so refined ladies read them anyway and just did not tell anyone. Mary Elizabeth Braddon wrote Lady Audley's Secret in 1862, about a beautiful woman with a dark past who commits bigamy and attempted murder. It was insanely popular. Everyone read it. But if you were a proper Victorian lady, you would hide the cover, maybe wrap it in brown paper, maybe tell people you were reading something else. Because admitting you enjoyed a story about a woman who defied every rule and almost got away with it, that was not done. Poetry was another dangerous territory. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, published in 1856, was controversial because it dealt with a woman choosing her own path, rejecting marriage for art. The poem included references to prostitution, illegitimate children, and social injustice. Some people loved it, others found it shocking, but women read it voraciously. They passed copies to each other, they quoted it in their diaries. Because it said things they were not allowed to say, it validated feelings they were not supposed to have. And then there were the books about science and medicine. If you wanted to understand your own body as a Victorian woman, you were out of luck. Medical knowledge was considered too indelicate for female minds. Books about reproduction and sexuality were kept locked away. Women were supposed to enter marriage completely ignorant of what would happen on their wedding night. The result? Fear. Trauma. Unwanted pregnancies because nobody had told them how any of this worked. Some progressive thinkers started writing books to educate women, but these were considered scandalous, obscene. They circulated secretly, shared among women who were desperate for information. There is a reason why, when archaeologists and historians go through Victorian homes today, they find books hidden in the strangest places, behind loose bricks in chimneys, under floorboards, in the hollow legs of furniture, in secret compartments in desks. These were not always valuable books. Sometimes they were just novels, just poetry, just words on a page, but they were words someone desperately wanted to read and someone else desperately wanted to keep from them. The control of reading material was part of a larger pattern of information control. Victorian society operated on the principle that knowledge should be hierarchical. Some people should know things that other people should not. Men should know more than women. Upper classes should know more than lower classes. Adults should know more than children. And the way you maintained that hierarchy was by controlling access to information, by deciding who got to read what, by creating a whole architecture of permission and prohibition around books. But here is what makes me love Victorian women so much. They did not accept this. They could have just read the approved books and stayed safely inside the lines, but they did not. They sought out the forbidden texts. They created networks to share them. They risked scandal and punishment to access ideas that society did not want them to have, because they understood something fundamental. Knowledge is power. And if someone is trying to keep knowledge from you, that means they are trying to keep power from you. Think about the Bronte sisters again. When they published their novels, they used male pseudonyms, Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. Why? Because books written by women were not taken seriously. They were dismissed as emotional, trivial, not worth reading. But books by men, those were literature, so the sisters hid their gender to get their work read, and their novels were shocking. Jane Eyre has a mad woman in the attic and a heroine who talks back to men and refuses to compromise her principles even when it costs her everything. Wuthering Heights is full of passion and violence and people making terrible decisions driven by obsessive love. The tenant of Wildfell Hall depicts domestic abuse and alcoholism and a woman who leaves her husband and supports herself as an artist. These were not safe, proper, ladylike stories. These were raw, real, dangerous, and women read them and recognize themselves. The irony is that while the Victorians were clutching their pearls about French novels corrupting English women were writing novels that were just as subversive. They just hid the subversion better. They couched it in moral language. They made sure their heroines suffered for their transgressions, at least temporarily. They added enough propriety to make the books publishable. But underneath was rebellion. Underneath was rage. Underneath was the truth about what it felt like to be a woman in a society that did not value you. Reading for Victorian women was not just entertainment. It was education. It was connection. It was proof that they were not alone in what they felt. When you read a book about a woman struggling against the constraints of society, you realize that you're not crazy for feeling constrained. You're not broken for wanting more. You're not defective for being angry. You are human, and you are not the only one. That is why reading had to be controlled. That is why books had to be forbidden. Because the moment women started reading widely, started accessing ideas from different cultures and different perspectives, they started questioning. And questioning led to thinking. And thinking led to wanting. And wanting led to demanding. And demanding led to change. The whole system of Victorian gender roles depended on women not realizing that there were alternatives. Books threatened that system just by existing, so women built secret libraries. They created hidden reading rooms. They turned their boudoirs into miniature bookstores of forbidden knowledge. They passed books back and forth like contraband. They read by candlelight while their husband slept. They hid novels in sewing baskets and poetry in hat boxes. They memorized passages so they could have them even if the books were taken away. They became smugglers of ideas, and every book they read, every page they turned, was an act of quiet revolution. The hidden reading rooms of Victorian houses were not always physical rooms. Sometimes they were mental spaces, the ability to close your eyes and remember a passage from a book nobody knew you had read. The secret pleasure of understanding a reference that was supposed to be over your head. The private knowledge that you had accessed information that was supposed to be forbidden to you. That was a kind of freedom that nobody could take away. Because once you have read something, once an idea has entered your mind, you cannot unread it. You cannot unknow it. It is yours forever. And that scared the censors more than anything. They could lock up books. They could create private cases and restricted sections. They could make lists of forbidden texts. But they could not control what happened after someone read those books. They could not control the thoughts that formed, the questions that arose, the possibilities that opened up. Once the knowledge was out there, once it was in a woman's mind, it was beyond their reach. So when you think about Victorian women in their secret reading rooms, surrounded by books they were not supposed to have, remember this: they were not just reading for pleasure, they were reading for survival. They were reading to understand themselves. They were reading to find out that they were not alone. They were reading to imagine different futures. They were reading because someone told them they should not. And that, more than anything, made reading worthwhile. But books were not the only thing Victorian women created in secret. Words on a page could be hidden, yes. But what about words on a canvas? What about art and music and all the other forms of expression that required space and materials and time? What happened when a woman wanted not just to consume knowledge, but to create it? Well, that is where things get even more complicated. Because being a reader was one thing, being a creator, that was rebellion on an entirely different level. And women who dared to create had to get even more creative about hiding their work, about finding spaces where they could be artists when society insisted they should only be ornaments. Creating something is different from consuming it. When you read a book, you can hide the evidence. You can slip it under your pillow when you hear footsteps, tuck it into a drawer, claim you were just dusting the shelf. But when you create, when you paint or write or compose music or take photographs, you need space and you need materials, you need time, you need permission to be absent from your duties, to lock yourself away, to prioritize something that is not directly serving your family. And in Victorian society, women were not supposed to prioritize anything that was not directly serving their family. So how did women create art in a world that insisted they should only be decoration, not decorators? The official Victorian position on women and creativity was contradictory, to put it mildly. On one hand, accomplishments were encouraged. A lady should be able to play the piano, sketch a landscape, maybe do some watercolours. These were seen as attractive qualities in a potential wife. evidence of refinement and education, something to show off at parties. But here is the catch. These activities were supposed to be amateur, decorative, light. The moment a woman took her creativity seriously, the moment she wanted to be excellent rather than merely adequate, the moment she treated her art as work rather than hobby, suddenly it became inappropriate, unfeminine, threatening. Because serious creativity requires ambition, and ambition in women was scandalous. A woman was supposed to be modest, self-effacing, content with her domestic role. If she wanted recognition for her work, if she wanted to sell it or exhibit it or have it taken seriously, that meant she valued herself. That meant she thought her ideas mattered as much as a man's ideas. And in Victorian society, that was basically heresy. So women who wanted to create had a choice. They could do it as a hobby, never taking it seriously, never pursuing excellence. Or they could do it seriously but hide it, pretend it was just a hobby while secretly pouring their souls into it. Create in secret, in stolen moments, in spaces nobody else knew about. And unsurprisingly, many women chose the second option. They became artists and writers and musicians in hiding, creating masterpieces in rooms nobody was supposed to enter. Let me tell you about a woman named Julia Margaret Cameron. Born in 1815, she did not even pick up a camera until she was 48 years old. Photography was still relatively new, expensive, technically complicated. Not something ladies dabbled in, but Cameron's daughter gave her a camera in 1863, supposedly to occupy her during her husband's long absences. And Cameron became obsessed. She turned a cold storage room at her house into a dark room, converted a chicken coop into a studio, convinced friends, family, servants, anyone she could find to pose for hours in elaborate costumes while she experimented with light and exposure. Her work was not decorative, not light, not amateur. She created haunting, beautiful, technically innovative portraits. She photographed famous people like Charles Darwin and Alfred Lord Tennyson. She created allegorical scenes inspired by literature and mythology. She pushed the boundaries of what photography could be as an art form. And she was relentless. When she wanted someone to pose, she did not take no for an answer. She would borrow costumes, create sets, work for hours to get the shot she envisioned. This was not a nice lady dabbling in a hobby. This was an artist pursuing her vision with single-minded intensity, and people did not know what to do with her. Some recognized her genius. She exhibited her work and sold prints and gained international recognition. But others dismissed her as eccentric, strange, too intense, too serious about something that should have been a pleasant pastime. The fact that she was older helped, ironically. She was past marriageable age. Her children were grown, so she had more freedom than a younger woman would have had. But even so, her commitment to her art was seen as unusual, slightly improper. A woman should not care that much about anything except her family. Or consider Harriet Hosmer, an American sculptor who spent most of her career in Rome. Born in 1830, she knew from childhood that she wanted to be a sculptor. But in America, women were not allowed to attend life drawing classes because seeing nude models was considered too corrupting. So at age 20, Hosmer moved to Rome, where the rules were slightly more relaxed. She studied anatomy, learned to work with marble, developed her technical skills, and she created sculptures that were monumental, powerful, not cute little decorative pieces, but serious works of art that were sometimes larger than life-size. She became successful, wealthy even. She supported herself entirely through her art, which was almost unheard of for a woman. But success came at a cost. She had to be careful about her reputation. She dressed in masculine clothing when working, which was practical for sculpture but scandalous for a woman. She lived independently without a husband, which raised eyebrows, and she faced constant accusations that she could not possibly have created her work herself, that she must have hired male assistants to do the actual sculpting. Because surely a woman could not be that talented, that skilled, that serious about her craft. The accusation that successful women artists must have had male help was depressingly common. It happened to painters, writers, musicians. If a woman produced something excellent, people would rather believe she had cheated than accept that she was genuinely talented. It was a no-win situation. If your work was mediocre, it proved women were not capable of serious art. If your work was excellent, it proved you must have had help. Either way, women could not win. So many women published or exhibited under male names. We talked about the Bronte sisters using male pseudonyms for their novels, but it was not just writers, it was composers, visual artists, anyone who wanted their work judged on its merits rather than dismissed because of their gender. George Eliot, the novelist, was actually Mary Ann Evans. She chose a male pen name because she wanted her work taken seriously as literature, not dismissed as women's fiction, and it worked. Her novels were resected, analysed, taken seriously right up until people found out she was a woman. Then suddenly the same critics who had praised her were finding flaws they had somehow missed before. The physical space required for creating was also a problem. If you wanted to write, you could maybe get away with using the family writing desk. But if you wanted to paint, you needed an easel, canvases, paints, storage for supplies. If you wanted to sculpt, you needed even more space, plus the money for materials. If you wanted to compose music, you needed time at the piano without interruptions. And in a Victorian household, women were constantly interrupted. Servants needed instructions. Children needed attention. Social calls had to be received. Meals had to be supervised. A woman was not supposed to lock herself away for hours at a time pursuing her own interests. Some women solved this by creating art that could be easily hidden or integrated into acceptable domestic activities. Needlework, for example, was considered appropriate for women. So women created elaborate embroidery and tapestries that were actually works of art but could pass as domestic handiwork. They painted on china and porcelain, which was acceptable because it was decorative and useful. They wrote in journals that looked like household account books. They found ways to be creative within the constraints they were given. But some women wanted more. They wanted dedicated studio space. And for those women, the secret rooms of Victorian houses became studios. Attic rooms that were supposed to be storage but were actually filled with canvases. Spare bedrooms that were officially guest rooms but had not seen a guest in years because they were full of art supplies. Converted outbuildings that were supposed to be used for one thing but were secretly being used for another. Women claimed space wherever they could find it and locked the door behind them. Photography, as it developed, offered interesting opportunities for women. It was a new medium, which meant there were not centuries of male dominance to overcome, and it could be done in a home studio, which made it more accessible. Women like Gertrude Kayserbeer and Frances Benjamin Johnston became successful photographers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They created their own studios, ran their own businesses, supported themselves through their art. But even then they faced resistance. Photography as a hobby was fine. Photography as a profession, that was pushing boundaries. There was also a phenomenon in the Victorian era of women creating boudoir photography. Not in the modern sense of glamour shots, but literally photographs taken in or inspired by the boudoir. Private, intimate spaces. Women in their dressing gowns, in relaxed poses, looking directly at the camera with expressions that were not demure or modest. These photographs were considered scandalous, obviously, but they were also powerful. They were women controlling their own image, deciding how they wanted to be seen, claiming ownership of their own bodies and their own gaze, and that was revolutionary. The thing about creating art is that it requires you to believe that your perspective matters, that your vision is worth preserving, that your ideas are valuable enough to put into the world. And Victorian society spent a lot of energy convincing women that their perspectives did not matter, that their vision was limited and inferior, that their ideas were not worth hearing. So every time a woman picked up a paintbrush or a pen or a camera, every time she chose to create rather than just consume, she was pushing back against that message. She was saying quietly or loudly, what I see is worth showing, what I think is worth writing, what I imagine is worth making real. And the women who did this, who created despite all the obstacles, they often paid a price. They were called eccentric, difficult, unwomanly. They were accused of neglecting their families, of having unnatural ambitions, of being unfeminine. Some lost friends, lost social standing, lost opportunities for marriage. But they kept creating anyway, because for them, not creating was worse. The cost of suppressing their creativity was higher than the cost of pursuing it. There is this beautiful, heartbreaking thing that Charlotte Bronte wrote in her teaching journal. She was stuck in a job she hated, teaching children when what she really wanted was to write. And she wrote about how her imagination would escape during lessons, how she would mentally travel to Angria, the fictional world she had created, and feel this intense, almost painful longing to be writing instead of teaching. She described it as half miserable and half ecstatic. Miserable because she could not fully inhabit her creative world. Ecstatic because that world existed, because her imagination was alive and powerful even when she could not act on it. That is what so many Victorian women experienced. This split existence. Part of them living in the acceptable world of domestic duties and social expectations. Part of them living in a secret creative world that society said should not exist. And the tension between those two worlds was constant, exhausting, but also generative. The very act of creating in secret, of stealing time and space to make art, that added an intensity to the work, a sense of urgency, a feeling that every moment spent creating was precious because it was stolen, forbidden, rare. Some women had supportive families who gave them space to create. Some had husbands who encouraged their work or at least did not actively prevent it. But many did not. Many had to fight for every minute, every inch of space, every scrap of validation. They had to justify their creative work as secondary to their real responsibilities. They had to downplay their ambitions and pretend they were not taking it seriously even when they were deadly serious. They had to be twice as good to be considered half as legitimate, and yet the work they produced was extraordinary. Literature that has lasted centuries, paintings that hang in museums, photographs that define the medium, music that still moves us, scientific discoveries, inventions, innovations, all created by women who were told they should not be creating at all, who had to hide their work or publish it anonymously or create it in stolen moments between domestic duties, who turned closets into studios and wrote novels on scraps of paper and composed music in their heads because they did not have access to an instrument. The secret studios of Victorian houses, whether they were actual rooms or just mental spaces, they were sites of resistance. Every brushstroke, every sentence, every photograph was proof that women were more than society wanted them to be, that they had visions and voices and talents that could not be suppressed, that creativity is not something you can legislate away or shame out of existence. It finds a way. It always finds a way. When renovators find old Victorian houses today and discover hidden rooms, sometimes what they find is art. Unfinished canvases, manuscripts, sheet music, evidence of creative work that was never shown to the world. And you have to wonder about the women who created those things, what they were thinking, what they were hoping, whether they knew their work would someday be discovered, or whether they were creating just for themselves, just to prove to themselves that they could. Either way, their work survived. It outlasted the social rules that tried to stop it. It outlasted the critics who dismissed it. It outlasted the systems that said women should not create. But creating art was not the only way Victorian women carved out economic autonomy in secret. Because here is something that does not get talked about enough. Victorian women were not just fighting for creative freedom or intellectual freedom. They were also fighting for economic freedom, for the ability to have money of their own, to control resources, to make financial decisions. And that fight required its own set of secret spaces and hidden strategies. Because in a system where women legally could not even own property, where every penny was controlled by fathers or husbands, financial independence was the most subversive thing you could achieve. And women found ways to achieve it anyway, one hidden coin at a time. Money is power. That is true today. And it was true in the Victorian era, maybe even more true then. Because if you had money, you had options. You could leave a bad situation. You could support yourself. You could make choices about your own life. And Victorian society understood this perfectly, which is why they made absolutely certain that women could not have money. Not really, not in any meaningful way. Until 1882, a married woman in England could not legally own property. Everything she had, her inheritance, her earnings, her possessions, even the clothes on her back, technically belonged to her husband. He could sell her jewellery, spend her inheritance, take her wages if she worked, and it was all perfectly legal. Think about what that means. You could be a wealthy woman before marriage, with thousands of pounds to your name. But the moment you said "I do," all of that wealth transferred to your husband. He could spend it however he wanted. Gamble it away, invest it badly, give it to his mistress, and you had absolutely no legal recourse. You could watch your entire fortune disappear and not be able to do a single thing about it. Is it any wonder that some women got creative about hiding money? The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 finally changed this, allowing women to own and control their own property and earnings. But that was late in the Victorian era. For decades before that, women had to find workarounds. And one of the most common workarounds was secret hiding places, hidden compartments in furniture, false bottoms in jewellery boxes, loose floorboards in bedrooms, concealed safes behind paintings. Victorian women turned their homes into treasure maps with X marking spots where they had hidden money their husbands did not know about. These were not always large sums. Sometimes it was just a few pounds, coins saved from household budgets, money meant for groceries that was carefully economised so there would be a little left over, gifts from sympathetic relatives who understood the situation, small amounts hidden carefully that added up over time to something that could save your life. Because that is what this money was, an escape fund. Money you could use to leave if your husband turned violent. Money you could use to support yourself if he died and left you with nothing. Money that was yours in a world that said nothing could be yours. The boudoir, which we talked about earlier, was a common place for these hiding spots. Because it was a woman's private space, men were less likely to go poking around in there. A jewellery box might have a false bottom. A dresser might have a secret drawer that only opened if you knew the trick. A writing desk might have a hidden compartment behind the regular drawers. These pieces of furniture were often designed with concealment in mind. Furniture makers in the Victorian era knew there was a market for pieces with secret compartments, and they delivered. But it was not just about hiding existing money. Some women found ways to earn money secretly. Needlework was a big one. Embroidery, lace-making, sewing. These were considered appropriate activities for women, so nobody questioned it if you spent hours on needlework. But some women were not just making things for their own household. They were selling their work, taking commissions, building a quiet business. The money would come in small amounts, easy to hide. And because needlework was seen as a hobby rather than work, husbands often did not realize their wives were earning income. Writing was another avenue. We have talked about women writing novels and poetry, but there was also a huge market for articles, essays, short stories. Women would write under pseudonyms and submit work to magazines and newspapers. The payment would go to a post office box or a friend's address. The husband never knew. The woman would cash the check and hide the money or use it for small luxuries that could be explained away. A new dress? Oh, it was on sale. A gift for a friend? I had some pin money saved. The earnings were camouflage within the normal flow of domestic expenses. Pin money is an interesting concept. It originally referred to the allowance a husband gave his wife for personal expenses, things like pins, which in the Victorian era were still relatively expensive. The phrase suggests something trivial, right? Money for pins. How much could that be? But pin money became a category that women could use to hide other earnings. If you made money from needlework or writing or selling preserves at the market, you could fold it into your pin money, and your husband would just assume he'd given it to you. It was financial sleight of hand. Some women also had what were called separate estates set up by their fathers before marriage. This was a legal workaround that wealthy families used to protect their daughters' inheritances. A father would create a trust that paid an allowance directly to his daughter, with stipulations that the husband could not touch the principal. It was not perfect protection, and it only worked if you had a wealthy father who cared enough to set it up. But for women lucky enough to have separate estates, it meant they had at least some financial independence. And they often guarded that allowance fiercely, hiding portions of it away for emergencies. Jewellery is particularly interesting in this context. It was one of the few forms of wealth a woman could somewhat control. Yes, technically her jewellery belonged to her husband, but socially it was considered hers, gifts from her family, heirlooms passed down through generations, and jewellery was portable, valuable, easy to hide, so women treated jewellery as both adornment and investment. They would hide pieces their husbands did not know about, keep particularly valuable items in secret locations. If everything went wrong, if she needed to leave, she could grab her hidden jewellery and pawn it for cash. There are documented cases of Victorian women who had entire sets of jewellery that their husbands never knew existed, hidden in false bottoms of trunks, sewn into the lining of clothing, buried in the garden in waterproof containers. This was not paranoia, this was survival strategy. Because in a society where divorce was nearly impossible and women had few legal rights, the ability to escape with enough money to survive could mean the difference between life and death. The really wealthy women had slightly different problems but similar solutions. If you were upper class, you might have family lawyers who managed your affairs. But even then, some women wanted financial information hidden from their husbands. They would correspond with the lawyers using code words, send letters to secret addresses, meet with financial advisors in locations their husbands would not think to check. The architecture of financial secrecy extended beyond physical hiding places into networks of trusted accomplices who helped women maintain some economic autonomy. Let me tell you about a concept called housekeeping money. The husband would give his wife a certain amount each week or month to run the household. Food, servants' wages, household supplies, everything. The wife was supposed to manage this efficiently, and here is where clever women found opportunity. If you could economize on groceries, if you could negotiate better prices with tradesmen, if you could stretch the household budget, the money you saved was yours to keep. Technically, it was supposed to go back to your husband, but if he did not ask for an accounting, and many did not because they considered domestic management beneath them, you could pocket the difference. This was not stealing exactly. You were still running the household efficiently, you were still fulfilling your duties. You were just also creating a financial cushion for yourself. And given that your husband legally controlled all the family money, including your inheritance if you had one, this felt more like reclaiming what should have been yours anyway. Some women became extraordinarily good at household management, not because they were naturally frugal, but because they were motivated. Every penny saved was a penny toward freedom. There were also informal banking networks among women. If you could not trust official banks, which often required a husband's permission for a woman to have an account, you could trust female friends and relatives. Women would hold money for each other. If you needed to hide £20, you would give it to your sister or your best friend for safekeeping. They might give you a piece of jewellery worth that amount as collateral, something you could sell if they died or betrayed you. These networks operated entirely on trust with no legal documentation, but they worked. Women protecting each other's financial secrets because they understood the stakes. The post office offered another opportunity. In the late Victorian era, the postal service started offering savings accounts. These were accessible to everyone, including women, and they did not require a husband's permission. You just needed to fill out a form and deposit money. The account was in your name. The money was yours. For women who had never had their own bank account, this was revolutionary. The postal savings accounts were not advertised as feminist tools, obviously. They were just practical financial services. But women understood what they meant: independence, security, a place to put money where nobody else could touch it. Some women also ran businesses from their homes without their husbands knowing, baking and selling pies or cakes, taking in laundry, giving music lessons, tutoring children. These were activities that could be explained as neighbourly favours or charitable work. Oh, I am just helping Mrs. Smith with her children. I am just baking extra because we had ingredients to use. The small payments would accumulate in hidden places, building toward financial autonomy one transaction at a time. The Victorian era also saw the rise of women-run philanthropic organisations, charities, reform societies, organisations for social causes, and these organisations handled money, significant amounts sometimes. Women who were not allowed to manage their own household finances became treasurers of charitable societies, managing budgets and making financial decisions. It was considered acceptable because it was for charity, for the public good. But it also gave women experience with money management, taught them how to keep books, negotiate with vendors, make strategic financial decisions, skills they could apply to their own secret financial lives. There is something both impressive and deeply sad about all this ingenuity. Impressive because these women were resourceful, clever, determined. They found cracks in the system and exploited them. They built networks of mutual support. They created financial security in a world designed to keep them financially dependent. But sad because they had to, because the system was so stacked against them that hiding money in floorboards was a reasonable survival strategy. Because women had to treat their own earnings like contraband, hidden from the men who legally controlled them. And it was not just about having money for emergencies, it was also about dignity, about feeling like you had some agency in your own life. If you knew you had £20 hidden in a false-bottom jewellery box, you were not completely powerless. You had options. Maybe you would never use them. Maybe your marriage was fine and you would never need that escape fund. But knowing it was there, knowing you had it if you needed it, that changed how you felt. It made you less vulnerable, less trapped. It gave you a foundation of security that society refused to provide. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 was supposed to fix all of this. And it helped, definitely. Women could finally own property in their own names, control their own earnings, make their own financial decisions, but social attitudes changed more slowly than laws. Even after 1882, many women continued to hide money, because old habits die hard, because they had learned not to trust systems that had failed them for so long. because financial secrecy had become a form of self-protection that was hard to give up even when it was no longer legally necessary. Today, when we find Victorian houses with secret compartments in the furniture, we often find coins, old currency, sometimes jewellery, evidence of women's hidden wealth. And each discovery is like reading a secret message from the past. Someone hid this here. Someone thought they might need it someday. Someone was planning, preparing, protecting themselves in the only way they could. These hidden treasures are not just about money. They are about autonomy, about the human need for security and independence, about refusing to be completely powerless even when the law said you had no power at all. The secret financial lives of Victorian women show us something important about resistance. It does not always look like protests and speeches and dramatic acts of defiance. Sometimes it looks like a woman carefully placing coins in a hidden drawer. Sometimes it looks like economizing on groceries and hiding the savings. Sometimes it looks like accepting payment for needlework and never mentioning it to your husband. Small acts, secret acts, but acts of resistance nonetheless. Acts that said, I will not be completely dependent. I will not be entirely without options. I will protect myself because nobody else will. But money was not the only thing Victorian women had to protect in secret. There was something even more valuable, even more dangerous to keep hidden. Something that could destroy you if discovered, but that some women chose to pursue anyway. Because for all the secrecy around finances and creativity and reading, there was one type of secret that was even more forbidden. One type of relationship that had to be hidden more carefully than anything else. And that is where our story goes next, into the most dangerous secret of all, the secret of forbidden love. Love letters are dangerous things. They are evidence, proof, written testimony that something happened between two people that maybe should not have happened. In our digital age, we worry about texts being screenshot, emails being forwarded, messages living forever in the cloud. But imagine living in an era where every letter you sent could be kept forever, reread, shared, used against you in a court of law, where your most private words, once written, became permanent artifacts that could destroy your entire life. That was the reality for Victorian women who dared to love outside the boundaries society drew for them. And yet they wrote anyway. They wrote love letters that they knew could ruin them. They wrote because love demands expression, even when expression is dangerous. Let me take you to 1890. Two women meet. Rose Cleveland, sister of President Grover Cleveland, and Evangeline Simpson, a wealthy widow. They meet in Florida during the winter social season, and they fall for each other. Hard. Immediately, undeniably, the kind of love that rewrites your understanding of yourself. And Rose starts writing letters. Letters that are passionate, explicit, extraordinary. In one letter, she describes an encounter between them that is, well, it is one of the most explicit expressions of same-sex desire written by a woman that has survived from the Victorian period. She describes physical intimacy in language that leaves no doubt about what happened between them. Reading it today, even knowing it will be used as historical evidence, feels almost voyeuristic. Like we are reading something never meant for outside eyes. But here is what makes these letters even more remarkable. Rose kept writing them for 20 years. Even after Evangeline married an Episcopal bishop, yes, you read that right, a 76-year-old Episcopal bishop, Rose wrote letter after letter begging Evangeline not to marry him, pleading, desperate. And when Evangeline went through with the marriage anyway, Rose wasted no time planning a multi-year trip to Europe with a different friend. The Victorian equivalent of a dramatic exit. The letters were sealed away in 1969 by the Minnesota Historical Society because the staff were spooked by their content. They literally put the letters in a separate box, sealed it, and closed it to researchers because they suggested two women had a sexual relationship, which of course they did. The box stayed sealed until 1978, when a historian heard about it and convinced the society to open it for research. And what emerged was this incredible documentation of love between women in an era that insisted such love did not exist. Here is the thing about love between women in the Victorian era. It occupied this strange space. On one hand, romantic friendships between women were common and socially acceptable. Women were supposed to be emotional, affectionate creatures. So if they had intense friendships, if they wrote passionate letters to each other, if they spent all their time together, that was fine. It was seen as innocent. Practice for heterosexual relationships, maybe, or just the natural emotionality of women. Men were not threatened by it because they did not take it seriously. The idea that women could have sexual relationships with each other was so unthinkable that it was not even illegal. The law criminalized male homosexuality but completely ignored lesbianism, not because they were more tolerant, but because they literally could not imagine it. This gave women a strange kind of freedom. They could write letters that were openly affectionate, even romantic, and nobody would question it. They could live together for years, share beds, declare their love, and society would just shrug and call them spinster friends. There is a term historians use for this: romantic friendship. And for a long time, historians insisted these relationships were not sexual, just emotionally intense friendships. But when you actually read the letters, when you look at the language used, when you see women describing their longing and their physical desire, it becomes pretty clear that many of these romantic friendships were romantic in every sense of the word. The secret rooms and hidden spaces we have been talking about became crucial for these relationships. Because while society might tolerate two women living together, there were still limits. There was still surveillance, servants, family members, neighbours. You could be affectionate in public to a degree, but you could not be obviously sexual. You could write letters, but you had to be careful about how explicit they were. So women created private spaces where they could be together without eyes watching, rooms where the door could be locked, passages between bedrooms that allowed discreet movement, places where their relationship could exist fully, without performance, without pretense. Anne Lister, who we talked about earlier and with her coded diaries, had relationships with several women throughout her life. She called them her wives in her coded entries, and she had specific spaces in her home where these relationships could be private. Her bedroom, her study, places where she could control access, and she was strategic about it. She understood that as long as she maintained a respectable public face, as long as she did not do anything that forced society to acknowledge what was happening, she could live relatively freely. It was a delicate balance, public respectability, private authenticity, but not all forbidden love was between women. There were also relationships that crossed class boundaries, which was almost as scandalous. Let me tell you about Hannah Culwick and Arthur Mumby. Hannah was a servant. Arthur was a middle-class lawyer and civil servant. They met when Hannah was in her 20s, working as a maid. Arthur had this obsession with working-class women, the dirtier and harder working the better. Which sounds creepy, and honestly, it kind of was. But he and Hannah fell into this intense, complicated relationship that lasted decades. Arthur kept detailed diaries about Hannah, documenting her work, photographing her in various costumes and poses. Hannah kept her own diaries too, from her perspective, and their relationship was unconventional, does not even begin to cover it. Hannah would visit Arthur in dirt, literally covered in the grime from her work, because that is what he wanted. They had this power dynamic that was part genuine affection, part master-servant role-play, part something else entirely. And eventually, after 18 years, They got married, in secret, because a middle-class lawyer marrying a servant was social suicide. So they lived this double life. In public, she was his maid. He paid her wages. She wore a servant's uniform. She called him Massa, which, yeah. But in private, at least sometimes she was his wife. They travelled to Europe together as husband and wife. But back in England, they returned to the charade, and Hannah wrote about all of this in her diary, about the complexity of loving someone while also serving them, about the confusion of being both wife and servant, about never quite knowing which role was real. Arthur stipulated in his will that their diaries should not be made public until 1950, 40 years after they both died. He knew the relationship was transgressive, he knew it would cause scandal, but he also knew it was important, worth documenting, worth preserving, even if it had to be hidden during their lifetimes. And when the diaries were finally opened, they revealed this fascinating, troubling, deeply human story about two people who loved each other across a divide that society said could not be crossed. The architecture of Victorian houses sometimes facilitated these cross-class relationships. Servants' staircases were separate from family staircases, ostensibly to keep servants invisible. But those separate staircases also created opportunities. A lady could slip down to the servants' quarters unseen. A servant could access the family rooms without going through public spaces. The very structure designed to maintain class separation also made it easier to violate that separation in secret. Unintended consequences of architectural control. Extramarital affairs were another category of forbidden relationship that required secret spaces. For men, having affairs was fairly socially acceptable, not officially condoned, but winked at. Boys will be boys and all that. But for women, an affair was catastrophic. Grounds for divorce, loss of children, complete social ruin. So when women had affairs, and some did, they had to be extraordinarily careful. Letters had to be destroyed or coded. Meetings had to happen in places where they would not be seen. And sometimes the affair happened inside the woman's own home, in rooms her husband did not think to check. There are stories of Victorian houses with passages between guest bedrooms and the ladies' chambers, officially for convenience, so guests could visit the lady without going through common areas. But those passages also allowed other types of visits. A family friend staying as a guest, a door that connected his room to hers. Who would notice if that door was occasionally used at night? The husband certainly would not check the guest bedroom. The servants would be discreet if they were loyal or well paid. And the affair could continue for years, hidden in plain sight, facilitated by architecture. The risk always was letters, because unlike secret meetings, which left no evidence once they were over, letters existed. They could be found, and they often were. We talked about Isabella Robinson earlier, whose diary was used against her, but there were countless other cases of letters being discovered and used as evidence in divorce proceedings or public scandals. Sometimes the letters were found by accident. A servant cleaning would find them hidden in a drawer. A child playing would discover them in a secret compartment. Sometimes they were found deliberately by a suspicious spouse going through belongings. Either way, once found, the letters became weapons. So women developed strategies for letters. Some destroyed all correspondence immediately after reading it. Some kept letters but hid them elaborately. False bottoms and secret panels and buried boxes. Some wrote in code or used ambiguous language that could be interpreted innocently if discovered. Some arranged for letters to be sent to a friend's address, so they never came directly to the house. It was a constant calculation of risk versus the desire to keep some record of the relationship, some token to prove it was real. There were also coded locations. If you could not write explicitly about meeting, you would develop a shared language. "I will visit the library Tuesday" might mean something else entirely. "The roses are blooming beautifully" could be a signal, innocuous phrases that meant something specific to the two people involved. This required trust, obviously, and memory. You had to remember the codes, know the signals, and trust that your partner remembered too. Jewelry was another way to mark these relationships. A ring or a locket given by a lover could be worn publicly because nobody knew its significance. It looked like any other piece of jewelry, but to the person wearing it, it was a constant reminder of the relationship, a secret symbol. Some women had photographs of their lovers in lockets, disguised as family members. "Oh, that is my cousin," when really it was the person they loved more than anyone. Small deceptions that allowed you to keep your love close, even when you had to pretend it did not exist. The emotional toll of these secret relationships was immense. Imagine loving someone and having to pretend you do not. Imagine wanting to share your life with someone but being unable to acknowledge them publicly. Imagine writing passionate letters and then having to burn them. Imagine every expression of love being dangerous, every moment together being stolen. The constant vigilance required would be exhausting. The fear of discovery would colour everything. And yet people did it. They loved in secret because loving openly was impossible. They took the risk because the alternative, a life without love, felt worse. Some of these relationships ended tragically. Discovered and destroyed. Lovers separated. Lives ruined. But some lasted. Couples who managed to maintain their secret for years, even decades. Who carved out small spaces of happiness in the margins of a society that did not want them to exist. Who died having loved fully, even if that love had to be hidden. And their letters, the ones that survived, are testaments to that love, proof that people have always found ways to love each other, regardless of what society said was allowed. Reading these letters today is like finding buried treasure. These intimate, passionate, honest expressions of love that someone wrote knowing they might never be seen. Or worse, that they might be seen by the wrong people and used as evidence of wrongdoing. The bravery it took to write these letters, to put feelings into words when words could be used against you, is staggering. Every sentence was an act of courage. Every declaration of love was also an acceptance of risk. And the secret spaces where these letters were written, where lovers met, where relationships existed outside of society's approval, those spaces were sanctuaries of a different kind than we have talked about before. Not sanctuaries from boredom or intellectual stifling or financial dependence. Sanctuaries for love itself. Rooms where you could be honest about who you loved and how you loved them. Where you could drop the performance and just feel, just be, just love. Those rooms, those hidden passages, those locked drawers full of letters, they were not just protecting people from discovery. They were protecting love from a society that wanted to dictate who you could love, how you could love them, and what that love was allowed to look like. And every time someone uses those spaces to love freely, they were saying no to that control. They were insisting that their love mattered, even if it had to exist in secret, even if it could never be acknowledged publicly, even if the only witnesses were the walls themselves. But as we have seen throughout this story, secrecy comes with a cost. And the cost was not just the constant fear of discovery or the emotional toll of hiding. Sometimes the cost was your freedom itself. Sometimes the cost was your sanity, or at least society's judgment of your sanity. Because Victorian society had a way of dealing with women who stepped too far outside the lines, women who wanted too much, felt too much, loved too much. And that brings us back to a dark place we touched on earlier, a place where the promise of sanctuary became the reality of imprisonment, where women went or were sent, supposedly for their own good, And what happened there tells us everything about how dangerous it was to be a woman who refused to conform. Here is the ultimate paradox of Victorian womanhood. The same society that built asylums to imprison inconvenient women also created genuine refuges for women who desperately needed safety. The same institutions that destroyed some women's lives saved others. And sometimes, horrifyingly, a woman's best option for escaping an unbearable situation was to be declared insane and locked away. How did we get to a place where institutionalization was preferable to freedom, where a cage looked like sanctuary? To understand that, we need to look at the other side of the asylum story. The side where women chose confinement because every other door was closed. Mary Lister was a Quaker woman born in 1766, and she did something remarkable. She founded the Invalid Asylum for respectable females in 1854, specifically for working-class women who needed medical care and had nowhere to go. This was not a mental asylum. This was a convalescent home, a place where women who worked in shops or as servants could recover from illness without losing everything. Because if you were a working woman in Victorian England and you got sick, you lost your job. And if you lost your job, you became destitute. There was no safety net, no sick leave, no workers' compensation. You either worked or you starved. Mary Lister recognised this. She saw women who were respectable, hard-working, decent people losing everything because they caught pneumonia or broke a leg or needed surgery. So she created a space where they could heal. The asylum could care for up to 26 patients at a time. In 1807 alone, 163 women sought sanctuary there. And the word sanctuary is important. These women chose to come. They were not committed by husbands or fathers. They applied, provided references attesting to their good character, and were admitted on their own behalf. The 11th annual report from 1838 to Mermswurser describes the institution's purpose beautifully. It embraces respectable females, employed in shops and in other dependent situations, and servants obliged by illness to quit their places. It offers them a temporary asylum widely differing from the crowded receptacles for the sick in our metropolis. The emphasis is on choice, on respectable credentials, on temporary refuge rather than permanent imprisonment. This was what an asylum was supposed to be, what the word originally meant: a safe place, a haven. The asylum was run entirely by women. A committee of 26 ladies, including titled aristocrats and royal patronage from Princess Alexandra, who later became queen. Mary Lister herself served as treasurer. The daily operations were handled by a matron, a nurse, and domestic servants, all women. This was radical. Most institutions were run by men, overseen by male doctors, controlled by male boards. But Lister created a matriarchal structure that promoted women's agency. Women caring for women. Women making decisions about women's health care. Women protecting women. And it worked. The asylum operated for decades, eventually expanding its services to offer more sophisticated medical care as the medical profession advanced. It went from being purely a convalescence home to becoming the home hospital for women, providing actual medical treatment. All still run by women, for women. It was proof that women could manage institutions, make medical decisions, handle finances, do all the things society said they could not do, and they did it by creating a space that was genuinely about care, not control. But here is the heartbreaking part. Even good asylums, even genuine sanctuaries like Mary Lister's, existed because the world outside was so hostile to women. You should not need a special institution to recover from illness. You should be able to get sick and heal in your own home, with your job waiting for you. But working women did not have that option, so the asylum became necessary, a band-aid on a gaping wound. Better than nothing, absolutely, life-saving even. but still evidence of a broken system. And then there were the private asylums for wealthy women. These were completely different from the overcrowded county asylums we talked about earlier. If you had money and your family wanted to help you rather than just hide you away, you could go to a private asylum that was more like a spa than a prison. Beautiful grounds, private rooms, activities and entertainment, medical care from physicians who actually tried to help. These places offered what they called moral treatment, the original humane approach to mental health care. Patients at good private asylums lived structured but pleasant lives. Daily routines that provided stability. Leisure activities tailored to their interests. Women could knit, sew, paint, play piano, walk in gardens, play cards. The goal was to occupy the mind with wholesome activities, to restore emotional balance through gentle routine. Some asylums had conservatories, music rooms, private chapels. Some allowed patients to use a carriage for outings. Some permitted church attendance alone, if the patient was deemed well enough. It was designed to be therapeutic, restorative, and for some women it genuinely was. If you were suffering from depression or anxiety or any number of legitimate mental health conditions that the Victorians did not know how to treat effectively, a stay at a good private asylum might actually help. The structure could be comforting. The removal from stressful situations could allow healing. The care and attention could make you feel valued. It was not perfect. Victorian medicine did not have effective treatments for most mental illnesses, but the environment itself could be healing. Peace, quiet, beauty, time to rest without the demands of domestic life pressing down on you. But here is where it gets complicated. These same lovely private asylums could also be used to imprison women who were not mentally ill at all, because from the outside it looked humane. If someone asked why your wife or daughter or sister was in an asylum, you could describe the beautiful facility, the pleasant activities, the excellent care. You sounded like a devoted family member ensuring your loved one got the best treatment. Meanwhile, that woman might be completely sane, just inconvenient, just asking for too much, just refusing to play the role assigned to her. There are documented cases of wealthy women who checked themselves into private asylums voluntarily because it was the only way to escape impossible situations. If you were in an abusive marriage and divorce was not an option, if you had no money of your own and no family to take you in, if your husband controlled everything and you had no legal recourse, being declared mentally unstable might be your best option. At least in the asylum you were away from him. At least you were safe from physical violence. At least you had a room of your own, even if you could not leave. Think about how broken a system has to be for that calculation to make sense. For imprisonment to be preferable to marriage. For institutionalization to feel like freedom. But for some women that was the reality. They chose the asylum. Not because they were mentally ill, but because it was the least bad option available. And that choice, that terrible choice, tells you everything about what their lives were like outside those walls. Some women formed communities inside asylums, friendships with other patients, bonds with sympathetic staff. They created little societies within the institution, with their own social dynamics and support networks. Women who understood each other's situations because they were living through similar things. Women who could be honest with each other in ways they could not be with the outside world. These connections sometimes lasted for years. Women would correspond after they left the asylum, visit each other, maintain friendships that had formed in that strange liminal space between sanctuary and prison. The staff at these institutions were usually women, particularly the nurses and attendants, and their position was complicated too. They were employed to care for patients, but they were also employed to control them. They had to enforce rules they might not agree with, administer treatments they knew were ineffective or harmful, participate in a system that was broken. But within those constraints, some staff members did what they could. They were kind when kindness was allowed. They bent rules when it was safe to do so. They listened when no one else would. They provided comfort in small ways that could not be documented or punished. There is a dynamic that emerges in these situations. Women caring for women, all of them trapped in different ways by the same system. The patients had no freedom. The staff had limited freedom. Both groups were subject to male oversight, male rules, male authority. So sometimes they allied with each other. A nurse might sneak a patient extra time in the garden. A patient might help a young attendant learn to read. Small acts of mutual support. Not enough to fix the system, but enough to make it slightly more bearable. The best private asylums tried to minimize the feeling of imprisonment. They avoided language like patient and ward, preferring guest and home. They designed buildings to look like country estates rather than hospitals. They created environments that felt more like boarding schools or hotels than medical facilities. But the doors were still locked. You still could not leave when you wanted. You were still subject to someone else's authority over your own life. No amount of pretty language could change that fundamental reality. And the admission criteria for these asylums was revealing. You needed to be respectable. You needed references. You needed to prove good character. Even places designed to help you required you to demonstrate that you deserved help, that you were worthy, that your troubles were legitimate rather than moral failings. The Victorians were obsessed with categorizing people as deserving or undeserving, and that categorization determined everything. What help you could access, what spaces were available to you, whether you were seen as a victim worthy of rescue or a problem to be managed. Mary Lister's asylum required 2 housekeepers to sign certificates attesting to an applicant's good moral conduct. This protected the institution's reputation, yes, but it also protected the patients. By insisting on respectability, Lister ensured that her patients would not be stigmatized. They were not fallen women or lunatics, or any of the derogatory categories Victorian society used. They were respectable females temporarily in need of care. That distinction mattered. It meant they could leave the asylum and return to their lives without being permanently marked as defective. But the flip side of that selectivity was that women who could not prove their respectability had nowhere to go. Women who had made mistakes. Women who had been victimized in ways that society blamed them for. Women who did not have 2 respectable housekeepers willing to vouch for them. Those women fell through the cracks. They ended up in the horrible overcrowded county asylums, or in workhouses, or on the streets. The system helped some women while abandoning others, and the deciding factor was not need, but perceived moral worth. This is the contradiction at the heart of Victorian charity and reform. There was genuine compassion, real desire to help. Women like Mary Lister who dedicated their lives to creating spaces where other women could heal. But that compassion was always conditional, always contingent on the recipient being the right kind of woman, respectable, deserving, morally acceptable. If you fell outside those boundaries, the compassion evaporated. You were on your own. And the women who ran these institutions, who served on charity boards and asylum committees, they were trapped in this contradiction too. They had so little power in the larger society. These institutions were some of the only places where they could exercise authority, make decisions, control resources. So they protected those institutions fiercely, which sometimes meant enforcing the very respectability standards that limited all women. It meant being gatekeepers, deciding who was worthy and who was not, perpetuating the system even while trying to create alternatives within it. There were women who saw this clearly, who recognized that the problem was not individual women failing to be respectable, but a system that categorized women as either angels or monsters with nothing in between. Women who pushed for actual systemic change rather than just charitable band-aids, But those women were often dismissed as too radical, too angry, too demanding, and sometimes, ironically, they were the ones who ended up in asylums. Because wanting to fundamentally change society was evidence of a disordered mind, obviously. A sane woman would accept her place. Only a mad woman would demand equality. The asylum, whether sanctuary or prison or some confusing mixture of both, was one of Victorian society's solutions to the problem of women who did not fit. Women who were too sick to work, too poor to support themselves, too sad to perform happiness, too angry to stay quiet, too ambitious to stay small. The asylum was supposed to fix these women, or at least remove them from public view. But what it actually did was reveal the bankruptcy of the whole system. Because if your society produces so many women who need to be institutionalized, maybe the problem is not the women. Maybe the problem is the society. The secret rooms of Victorian houses were one form of escape. Hidden spaces where women could be themselves, at least temporarily. But the asylum was another form of escape, darker and more desperate. A place where women went, or were sent, when the secret rooms were not enough, when the hidden sanctuaries could not protect them anymore, when the weight of pretending became unbearable. Some women were destroyed there, some women found peace there. Most experienced something complicated and contradictory, because that is what these institutions were. Complicated, contradictory, both helpful and harmful, both sanctuary and prison. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. What happened when women decided they were done with secret rooms and hidden sanctuaries? When they decided that escaping into private spaces was not enough? When they wanted not just personal freedom but actual power? When they stopped hiding and started demanding, because that is where this story ultimately goes. From secret resistance to open rebellion, from hidden rooms to public squares, from whispered conversations to shouted demands, the secret spaces taught Victorian women that they deserved more, and eventually some of them decided to fight for it. Sometimes a house becomes a prison, not because the doors are locked, but because there is nowhere safe to go once you leave. We have talked about women hiding money, hiding books, hiding love, hiding themselves in secret rooms scattered throughout Victorian houses. But what happens when hiding is not enough? What happens when the danger is not discovery but the home itself? When the person you need to escape from is the one who controls every door, every window, every exit? Victorian architecture gave women hiding places, yes, but some women needed more than hiding places. They needed escape routes. And the same secret passages that served as sanctuaries also served, sometimes as literal paths to freedom. The hidden staircases in Victorian houses were not always about privacy or propriety. Sometimes they were about survival. A narrow staircase behind a false panel, a door disguised as wall, a passage connecting bedrooms in ways the official floor plan did not show. These features were useful for servants moving invisibly through the house, absolutely. But they were also useful for anyone who needed to leave a room quickly without being seen. And in households where domestic violence was happening, which was far more common than Victorian propriety liked to admit, those hidden exits could save lives. Domestic violence was not talked about, not openly. The Victorian ideal was that the home was sacred, peaceful, a haven from the harsh world outside. Women were supposed to make the home a sanctuary for their husbands. And if your husband beat you, well, that was a private matter, between husband and wife, not something to be discussed in polite society. The law gave husbands almost unlimited authority over their wives. A man could legally hit his wife, control her movements, confine her to the house. She had virtually no legal recourse. Police would not intervene in domestic matters. Courts would not hear cases unless the violence was extreme and could be proven. And even then, The burden of proof was on the woman, who often had no witnesses because violence happened in private. So women developed strategies, and one of those strategies was knowing the house better than anyone else, knowing which floorboards creaked and which ones did not, knowing which doors had locks and which ones could be barricaded, knowing the hidden passages and secret exits. If you were a lady in a Victorian mansion and your husband came home drunk and violent, being able to slip through a concealed door into a servant's passage and make your way to a locked room could mean the difference between injury and safety. The architecture became a tool for survival. Some women prepared more extensively. They kept escape bags hidden in secret compartments, a small suitcase with a change of clothes, hidden money, important documents, jewellery that could be pawned. Everything you would need to leave suddenly and not come back. These bags were hidden in places husbands would not think to look, in the attic, in a servant's room, behind a false panel in a wardrobe, under floorboards in spaces that were technically part of the house but psychologically outside his territory. And the woman would know exactly where the bag was, exactly how to get to it, exactly which route would get her out of the house unseen. Where would she go? That was the impossible question. If you left your husband in Victorian England, you had almost nowhere to turn. Your own family might refuse to take you in because your presence would be scandalous. Friends would distance themselves to protect their own reputations. Hotels would not rent to a woman alone without references. Employment was nearly impossible to get without your husband's permission. And if you had children, leaving meant abandoning them because they legally belonged to him. So most women stayed. They endured. They survived. But some planned their escapes anyway, even knowing how difficult it would be. Because staying meant enduring violence indefinitely. Leaving meant hardship, but at least it meant possibility. There were a few refuges. By the late Victorian era, some charitable organisations started opening homes for women fleeing domestic violence. These were controversial. Critics said they encouraged women to abandon their marital duties, that they broke up families, that they allowed women to escape consequences of their own poor behaviour. Because obviously, if your husband was violent, you must have provoked him somehow. But the homes operated anyway. Quietly, often without much publicity. They provided temporary shelter, a place to stay while you figured out what to do next. Not a solution, but a reprieve. Some Victorian houses were part of earlier networks that had nothing to do with domestic violence, but everything to do with escape. The Underground Railroad, primarily active before the American Civil War, used houses with hidden rooms and secret passages to shelter escaped slaves moving from south to north. And while this was mainly an American phenomenon, the principle applied elsewhere too. In England, houses that had once hidden Catholic priests during periods of persecution, houses with priest holes and secret chapels, sometimes repurposed those spaces for other kinds of refugees. People fleeing persecution, women fleeing violence, anyone who needed to disappear. There is a house in Indiana that was part of the Underground Railroad, and it had a back room with 5 different doors, 5 separate exits. If slave catchers came to one door, the people hiding could escape through another, and there were cramped hiding spaces off bedrooms where escaped slaves would stay for days or even weeks, waiting for the danger to pass. The architecture of escape was built into the structure. Multiple options, redundant exits, spaces that could be sealed and hidden quickly. This was not about aesthetics or privacy. This was about life and death. Victorian women fleeing violence had to think the same way. One exit was not enough because it could be blocked. One hiding place was not enough because it could be discovered. You needed backup plans, alternative routes, multiple strategies, and you needed to keep all of this secret because if your husband discovered that you were planning to leave, the violence would escalate. Escape planning had to happen in absolute secrecy, using the same hidden spaces and coded communications that women used for everything else they were not supposed to do. Some women disappeared, vanished without a trace. They would leave through a secret door one night and never be seen again. Sometimes these disappearances ended happily, with the woman building a new life somewhere far away under a new name. Sometimes they ended in tragedy, but the point is, they happened. Women who were supposedly powerless, supposedly trapped, found ways to vanish. They used their knowledge of the house, their hidden resources, their secret networks, and they got out. The servants often knew. They saw what happened behind closed doors. They heard the arguments. They saw the bruises. And sometimes they helped. A loyal servant might pack a bag for her mistress and hide it in the servants' quarters, might leave a door unlocked on a specific night, might provide information about the husband's schedule so the woman would know when it was safe to leave. This was risky for servants too. If caught helping a wife escape, they would be fired without references, which meant they would struggle to find other work. But some did it anyway. Women helping women. Class divisions mattering less than shared understanding of what it meant to be vulnerable to male violence. There were also cases of women who did not escape but fought back. Victorian newspapers occasionally reported cases of women killing abusive husbands. These cases were sensational, scandalous. Often, the woman would claim self-defense. Sometimes juries believed her, especially if the evidence of abuse was overwhelming. Sometimes they did not, but even when women were convicted, public sympathy was sometimes on their side. Because even in Victorian society, which granted husbands enormous authority, there was recognition that some men went too far, that some violence was excessive even by the standards of the time. The secret rooms in these cases became crime scenes, evidence of what had been happening. A locked bedroom where a woman had barricaded herself, a hidden space where she had stashed weapons for self-defense, a passage she had used to escape previous attacks. The architecture told stories the women themselves often could not tell, because who would believe them? Who would take their word over their husbands? But the physical evidence, the spaces themselves, those could not be dismissed so easily. Now, not all escape was about violence. Some women left for other reasons, marriages that were not violent but were unbearable. Situations where they felt trapped not by physical danger, but by spiritual and emotional suffocation. These escapes were just as carefully planned but less urgent. A woman might save money for years, correspond secretly with relatives who agreed to help, plan every detail of her departure, and then one day, while her husband was away, she would pack her belongings, slip out through a servant's entrance, and disappear into a new life. Where did these women go? Some to relatives in distant cities, some to convents, which offered shelter to women who wanted to withdraw from the world. Some to other countries entirely, starting fresh where nobody knew them. Some changed their names, invented new histories for themselves, became different people. The Victorian era, with its limited communication technology and record-keeping, made this possible in ways that would be much harder today. You could reinvent yourself if you were brave enough, if you were desperate enough. The psychological weight of planning an escape while pretending everything was normal must have been crushing, smiling at breakfast while knowing you were planning to leave, making polite conversation while mentally cataloguing everything you needed to take with you, sleeping next to someone while planning to portray what he saw as his fundamental right to control you, the duplicity required, the constant performance, the fear that any small slip would give you away. It required extraordinary mental strength, extraordinary courage. Some women did not make it. Their escape attempts were discovered. They were caught before they could leave or brought back after they fled. The consequences were often severe: increased isolation, tighter control. Sometimes commitment to an asylum because clearly a woman who tried to leave her husband must be insane. The failed escape made everything worse. So the women who succeeded, who made it out, they were not just lucky, they were strategic, careful, patient. They waited for the right moment. They prepared meticulously. They left nothing to chance. And the houses that facilitated these escapes, the secret doors and hidden passages and concealed spaces, they were part of a larger architectural language of resistance. Every hidden door was a potential escape route. Every secret panel was a potential hiding place. Every concealed passage was a potential path to freedom. The Victorians built these features for propriety, for class separation, for maintaining appearances, but women repurposed them, turned them into tools of survival, used the very architecture designed to control them as a means of escape. There is something powerful about that, taking the tools of your oppression and using them for liberation. The secret rooms were built to keep women hidden. Yes, but hidden also means protected. Secret also means private. And privacy, even limited privacy, creates space for planning, for thinking, for imagining alternatives. The boudoir where you hid forbidden books was also where you hid escape money. The passage designed for servants was also the route you would use to flee. The architecture was complicit in your oppression, but it could also be complicit in your escape. Not every woman who needed to escape could manage it. The obstacles were too great, the risks too high, the resources too limited. Most women stayed, endured, survived as best they could. But the fact that some women escaped, that some found ways out despite everything, that matters. It proves that the system was not absolute, that even in the most controlling circumstances, agency was possible, choice existed. Freedom, however difficult to achieve, was not completely impossible. The legacy of these escape routes is still with us. Today we have domestic violence shelters, hotlines, legal protections, resources that Victorian women could only dream of. But we also still have women planning escapes, hiding money, creating exit strategies. Because while the legal situation has improved, the fundamental dynamic of intimate partner violence has not changed as much as we would like to think. Women today still need escape routes, still need secret plans, still need places to hide money and evidence and themselves. The tools have changed, but the need has not. When renovators find Victorian houses with secret passages and hidden rooms today, they usually think about the romance of it, the mystery. How exciting to have a hidden door in your house. But some of those passages were escape routes. Some of those hidden rooms were safe rooms. Some of that architecture saved lives. And understanding the desperate necessity behind the secret spaces changes how we see them. They are not just quirky historical features. They are evidence of women's resistance. Proof that even in the most constrained circumstances, people find ways to survive, to protect themselves, to escape. But as we have seen throughout this journey, escape was complicated. And what comes after escape is even more complicated. Because leaving a bad situation does not automatically mean arriving at a good one. Freedom from one form of control does not guarantee freedom from all control. And the Victorian women who escaped their homes often found themselves facing new challenges, new systems of control, new forms of oppression. The fight for true freedom, for real autonomy, required more than just escaping through a secret door. It required changing the society that made those secret doors necessary in the first place. And that is where we go next. Living in secret takes a toll, a psychological price that compounds over time. Every hidden book, every concealed coin, every locked diary, every disguised feeling, they all require energy, mental bandwidth, constant vigilance. You have to remember what you told whom, what you are hiding from which person, which version of yourself you are performing in which space. The cognitive load of maintaining a double life is exhausting, and eventually something has to give. Either the secrets are discovered and everything falls apart, or the person keeping the secrets reaches a breaking point, or in rare cases, the person decides that hiding is not enough anymore, that the cost of secrecy is higher than the cost of honesty, that it is time to stop whispering and start shouting. The Victorian era did not end because Queen Victoria died in 1901. It ended because the contradictions at its heart became unsustainable. You cannot build an entire society on the premise that half the population should be decorative angels, while simultaneously relying on those same people to run households, raise children, manage servants, and increasingly work in factories and shops and offices. You cannot insist that women have no intellectual capacity while women are writing novels that outsell anything men produce. You cannot claim women are too delicate for politics while they are organising massive charitable organisations and social reform movements. Eventually the performance collapses under its own weight, and the women who had been hiding in secret rooms started stepping out into public spaces, started demanding things openly rather than carving them out secretly, started organising, started fighting. The late Victorian era and the Edwardian period that followed saw the rise of the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, and all kinds of social reform efforts led primarily by women. These were not separate from the secret rooms. They grew out of them. The skills women learned hiding books and money and identities, those skills translated into organising underground movements and secret meetings and strategic campaigns. Think about what happens when you spend your entire life learning to hide things from authority figures. You get very good at it. You learn patience, you learn strategy, you learn how to create networks of trust, you learn how to communicate in code, you learn how to move resources without being detected. All of those skills, developed out of necessity in private homes, became incredibly useful in public activism. The women who had been hiding feminist literature in their boudoir started distributing it openly in the streets. The women who'd been secretly saving money started fundraising for political causes. The women who had been writing encoded diaries started writing manifestos and pamphlets. The suffragettes, the women who fought for voting rights in the early 20th century, they were militant, aggressive. They broke windows, set fires, went on hunger strikes when imprisoned, chained themselves to railings. These were not women who believed in quiet acceptance anymore. They had tried quiet. They had tried asking nicely. They had tried working within the system, and none of it worked, so they escalated. And society was shocked. How could these ladies, these supposed angels, behave so badly? How could respectable women engage in violence and destruction? But if you understand the secret rooms, if you understand the decades of hidden resistance that preceded the public activism, it makes perfect sense. The violence did not come from nowhere. It came from generations of suppressed rage, from mothers and grandmothers who had hidden their anger in locked diaries, from great-grandmothers who had swallowed their ambitions because there was no outlet for them. The suffragettes were not aberrations, they were the inevitable result of a system that had been crushing women for centuries. The pressure had to release eventually, and when it did, it was exclusive. Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the leaders of the suffrage movement in Britain, founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 2003. Their motto was deeds, not words. They were done talking, done petitioning politely, done asking permission. They engaged in direct action, civil disobedience, and they were punished for it. Arrested, imprisoned, force-fed when they went on hunger strikes. The government's response was brutal, but the movement did not stop. It could not be stopped. Because it was not just a few radical women anymore. It was a fundamental shift in consciousness. Women who had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, that they were incapable, that they should be grateful for male protection, those women were saying no, loudly, publicly, unapologetically. And here is what I find fascinating. The tactics the suffragettes used were very similar to the tactics women had been using in private for decades. Secrecy, networks, strategic planning, resource management. The difference was scale and visibility. Instead of one woman hiding money in a false-bottom jewellery box, it was hundreds of women pooling resources to fund a movement. Instead of two women exchanging coded letters, it was networks of activists communicating through underground newspapers and secret meetings. The infrastructure of resistance had always been there. It just went public. The backlash was intense. Women who participated in suffrage activism were called unwomanly, hysterical, dangerous. They were socially ostracized. They lost jobs. They were disowned by families. The same accusations that had been used to control women privately were now weaponized publicly. If you demand the vote, you are clearly insane. If you protest, you are obviously hysterical. If you refuse to accept your subordinate position, you must be morally defective. The insults were predictable because they were the same insults that had been used to justify keeping women in secret rooms in the first place. But public activism has one crucial advantage over private resistance. It is visible. It cannot be denied or ignored. When women were suffering in secret, society could pretend everything was fine. When women started marching in the streets, that pretense became impossible. The suffering was on display, the anger was undeniable, and that visibility, as painful and dangerous as it was, created change. Because you cannot fix a problem you refuse to acknowledge exists. The secret rooms had allowed individual women to survive. Public activism demanded systemic change. The cost of that activism was real, though. Women were beaten by police, imprisoned under terrible conditions, force-fed through tubes shoved down their throats, a procedure so traumatic that many women never recovered psychologically. Some died. Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in Mod 13 and was killed. Whether it was suicide or an attempt to grab the horse's bridle, we will never know. But her death galvanized the movement, made her a martyr, proved that women were willing to die for this cause. And slowly, painfully, the system started to crack. Not because men in power suddenly became enlightened, but because the pressure was too great to resist, the activism was too persistent, the arguments were too compelling. In 1918, some women in Britain got the vote. Not all women. Only women over 30 who met property qualifications. Full suffrage did not come until 1928. In the United States, it was 1920. Different countries had different timelines, but the pattern was the same everywhere. Decades of private suffering, decades of secret resistance. Then public activism. Then violent backlash. Then finally grudging concessions. But voting rights were just one piece. The deeper work was cultural, changing how society thought about women, challenging the idea that women were naturally inferior, naturally suited only for domestic life, naturally in need of male control. That work is still ongoing. We are still doing it today, because legal rights do not automatically translate to social equality. Victorian women got property rights in 1882, but that did not immediately change the cultural expectation that women should defer to male authority. They got the vote in 1918 and 1928, but that did not immediately change the belief that women were less rational than men. The secret rooms were a symptom of a sick system, a system that forced women to hide essential parts of themselves to survive. But they were also incubators of resistance, spaces where women developed the skills and strategies they would later use publicly. Spaces where they preserved knowledge and resources and connections that the dominant culture tried to erase. Spaces where they proved to themselves that they were more than society said they were. Think about what it takes to maintain a secret life. You have to be smart, strategic, patient, resilient. You have to be able to think multiple steps ahead. Anticipate problems, create backup plans, manage resources carefully, build and maintain trust networks. All of those are leadership skills, management skills, political skills. The Victorian era insisted women did not have those skills, but the secret rooms proved otherwise. Every woman who successfully hid money, planned an escape, maintained a forbidden relationship, or created art in secret was demonstrating competence that society denied she possessed. And when those women stepped into public activism, they brought those skills with them. The suffrage movement was not just about passion and anger, though it had plenty of both. It was also extraordinarily well organized, strategic, sophisticated. These were women who knew how to run complex operations while appearing to do nothing. They'd been doing it in their homes for years. Now they were doing it in public for political purposes, and it turned out they were very, very good at it. The Victorian era also taught women something else crucial. It taught them that men in power will not give up that power voluntarily, that asking nicely does not work, that being respectable and obedient and grateful does not earn you rights, that you have to take what you need because it will not be given. The secret rooms were individual solutions to systemic problems, but eventually women realized that individual solutions were not enough, that the problem was not individual bad men, but a system that empowered all men at the expense of all women, and that required a collective response. Not every woman became an activist, most did not. Most continued living in the grey area between total compliance and open rebellion, carving out small freedoms where they could, hiding what needed to be hidden, compromising where necessary. And that is okay. Not everyone can be a revolutionary, not everyone should be. Social change requires both the people on the front lines taking risks and the people in the background providing support and maintaining stability. Both are essential. But the existence of public activism changed things for all women, even those who never participated. Once suffragettes were marching in the streets, the private resistances seemed less radical by comparison. The woman hiding books in her boudoir was now the moderate. The woman secretly managing money was just being prudent. The standards shifted. What had been scandalous became merely unconventional. What had been unthinkable became possible. The Overton window moved, and it moved because women pushed it. The secret rooms did not disappear when women got more rights, but their function changed. They were no longer the only space where women could be themselves. They were no longer desperate hiding places, but choices. A woman might still want a room of her own, a private space, a sanctuary from the world. But now it was because she wanted privacy, not because she needed secrecy to survive. That is a huge difference. Privacy as preference versus secrecy as survival. Both involve hidden spaces, but the psychological reality is completely different. By the time World War I started in 1914, the Victorian era was definitively over. The war shattered many of the remaining illusions about gender roles. Women worked in factories making munitions. They served as nurses near the front lines. They drove ambulances and ran farms and took over jobs that had been considered too difficult, too dangerous, too important for women. And they proved yet again that all those limitations had been artificial. Women could do the work. They had always been able to do the work. Society had just refused to let them. The post-war period saw massive social changes. Shorter skirts, looser corsets, women smoking in public, driving cars and going to university, working in professions. None of it would have been possible without the groundwork laid by Victorian women, the ones who hid books and money and identities. the ones who carved out small spaces of autonomy in houses designed to control them, the ones who proved, day after day, in secret rooms nobody was supposed to know about, that women were capable of so much more than society allowed. The secret rooms were never just about hiding. They were about preserving, protecting, preparing. They were spaces where women kept alive the knowledge that they deserved more, the hope that things could change, the skills they would need when change became possible. And when the time came when the pressure built up enough, those spaces emptied out. The women stepped into public view, and they changed the world. But that brings us to one final question. What happened to those secret rooms? The physical spaces, yes, but also the psychological ones. When women no longer needed to hide quite so desperately, what became of the hidden passages and concealed compartments and locked doors? Did they disappear, or did they transform into something else? And what can those rooms, both the ones that still exist and the ones that live only in diaries and letters and memories, teach us today? Because the story of Victorian women and their secret spaces is not just history, it is a mirror. And what we see when we look into it might surprise us. Every few years, someone discovers a hidden room in a Victorian house. It makes the news, people get excited, renovators pulling down a wall and finding a sealed-off space, a narrow staircase revealed when old panelling is removed, a door that has been painted over so many times it looked like part of the wall. And inside these rooms, sometimes there are artifacts, old newspapers, furniture covered in dust, letters, photographs, personal items that someone hid away 150 years ago. And we look at these discoveries with fascination, with curiosity. We wonder who used that room, what they were hiding, why the space was sealed away. But here is what I think we should really be asking. What are we still hiding? What secret rooms exist in our own lives? Because the impulse that created those Victorian sanctuaries has not disappeared. We still need private spaces. We still keep secrets. We still hide parts of ourselves from the world. The architecture has changed, yes. We have digital hiding places now instead of physical ones. Encrypted messages instead of cross-written letters. Cloud storage instead of false-bottom jewellery boxes. But the fundamental human need for privacy, for sanctuary, for space to be ourselves without judgment, that remains. The Victorian secret rooms teach us something important about the relationship between constraint and creativity. When you are told you cannot have something, you find ways to have it anyway. When you're denied official space, you create unofficial space. When the front door is locked, you look for a side entrance. Victorian women were some of the most constrained people in modern history, and yet they were also remarkably creative in finding freedom. They repurposed architecture designed to control them into tools for liberation. They turned limitations into opportunities. They made secrecy itself a form of power. Today we look back at Victorian women and feel grateful we do not live under those restrictions, and we should feel grateful. Legal equality, while imperfect, is vastly better than legal subordination. The ability to own property, vote, work, divorce, control our own bodies, these are precious rights that women fought and died for. We should never take them for granted, but we should also be honest about what we have not solved. We still live in a world where women face violence, discrimination, and control. The methods have changed, the laws have improved, but the fundamental dynamics are still there, just in different forms. Domestic violence has not disappeared. Women still plan escapes, still hide money, still create safety strategies. The statistics are horrifying. 1 in 3 women worldwide experiences physical or sexual violence in her lifetime, most often from an intimate partner. That is billions of women, and many of them are doing exactly what Victorian women did, hiding resources, planning exits, creating secret spaces where they can be safe, at least temporarily. We have better legal protections now, better resources, shelters and hotlines and restraining orders, but the need for escape routes has not gone away. Economic inequality persists too. Women still earn less than men for the same work, still face discrimination in hiring and promotion, still do the majority of unpaid domestic labour. And while we can legally own property and control our earnings, the practical reality is that many women still struggle for financial independence. The hidden savings account, the secret stash of cash, the careful economizing to create a buffer, these strategies have not become obsolete. They have just taken modern forms, and the pressure to hide parts of ourselves, to perform versions of femininity that are acceptable to others, to manage how we are perceived, that has not disappeared either. The expectations have changed. We are no longer required to be passive angels in the home, but we are expected to be superwomen who excel at work and at home, who are professionally ambitious but also devoted mothers, who are sexually confident but not too sexual, who are strong but not threatening, who are successful but not intimidating. The contradictions have multiplied, and so we perform, we code switch, we show different versions of ourselves in different contexts, we hide the parts that do not fit. Social media has created new forms of secret keeping. We curate our public image carefully, present the version of ourselves we want others to see. Meanwhile, our private selves, our real thoughts and feelings and struggles, those often remain hidden. We have burner accounts for our real opinions, private group chats for honest conversations, encrypted messages for things we do not want preserved. The technology is new, but the impulse is old. The desire to have both a public self and a private self, to control what is seen and what is kept secret. The queer experience today has parallels with Victorian secret keeping too. Yes, legal rights have expanded dramatically. Yes, cultural acceptance has improved. But many LGBTQ people still navigate spaces where they cannot be fully out, where they have to hide relationships, identities, or aspects of themselves for safety or professional survival. The coded language, the careful management of information, the double life. These are not historical curiosities. They are current realities for millions of people. What the Victorian secret rooms show us is that human beings are incredibly resilient. We adapt, we survive, we find ways to be ourselves even in hostile environments. But also show us that we should not have to. That secrecy should be a choice, not a necessity. That privacy is different from hiding. That a room of one's own should be a sanctuary chosen freely, not a hiding place required for survival. Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own in 1929, arguing that women need both literal and metaphorical space to create, to think, to be. So she was writing decades after the Victorian era ended, but she understood the legacy. She understood that women had been denied space for so long that claiming space was itself a political act. And her argument remains relevant today. Everyone needs space. Physical, mental, emotional space to exist without constant surveillance or judgment. The houses we build reflect our values. Victorian houses, with their rigid separation of men's and women's spaces, their servants' passages, their emphasis on propriety and appearance, they reflected Victorian values. Hierarchy, control, performance. The secret rooms were resistance to those values, but they were also shaped by them. Today we build open floor plans, shared spaces, homes designed for casual living rather than formal entertaining. But we also build home offices and guest rooms and she sheds and man caves. We still create designated spaces for different aspects of ourselves. What would it look like to build a house, a society, where secret rooms were not necessary? where everyone could be fully themselves in every space, where privacy was respected but secrecy was not required for safety. I do not know if that is possible. Humans seem to need some separation between public and private selves. Some aspects of ourselves are for sharing, others are for keeping, and that is okay. The problem is not secrecy itself. The problem is forced secrecy, required hiding, the difference between choosing privacy and needing to hide. The Victorian women in their secret rooms were telling us something important. They were saying, "I exist beyond what you see. I contain multitudes. I have thoughts and feelings and desires and ambitions that do not fit your categories, and I will preserve them even if I have to hide them." That message echoes through time. Every person who has ever felt unseen, unheard, misunderstood, or actively suppressed understands it. The secret room is wherever we go to be real, to drop the performance, to exist without editing ourselves. Today, when renovators find those Victorian secret rooms, they usually turn them into something visible, an office, a reading nook, a cozy space that is charming rather than hidden. The concealed door becomes a conversation piece rather than a necessity, and that transformation is good. It means we no longer need those spaces to serve their original function. But I hope we do not forget why they existed. I hope we remember the women who hid books and money and love and themselves in those spaces. I hope we honour their resilience while also acknowledging their suffering. The secret rooms are monuments to both human creativity and human cruelty, to the incredible lengths people will go to preserve their humanity, and to the oppressive systems that make such lengths necessary. They remind us that progress is possible but not inevitable, that rights once won can be lost, that the fight for dignity and freedom is ongoing, that every generation has to decide whether to accept the world as it is or work to make it better. As we close the door on this journey through Victorian secret spaces, I want you to think about this. What rooms in your life are secret? What parts of yourself do you hide and why? Are you hiding by choice or by necessity? And if by necessity, what would need to change for you to step into the light? These are not easy questions. They do not have simple answers, but they are worth asking. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago. The women who lived in those houses, who created those hiding places, who wrote those secret diaries and hid those precious coins, they're all gone now, but their legacy remains. In the houses that still stand with their hidden passages intact, in the letters and diaries preserved in archives, in the rights we now enjoy that they fought for, in the ongoing struggle for equality and dignity, and the right to exist fully and freely. Every hidden room that is discovered today is a message from the past, a reminder that people have always needed space to be themselves, that resistance takes many forms, some loud and public, some quiet and private, that survival requires both adaptation and refusal, that you can live within a system while also resisting it, that small acts of defiance compound over time into massive social change. The walls of those Victorian houses hold secrets we will never fully uncover. Letters burned, diaries destroyed, stories lost to time, but enough remains to paint a picture, to understand something essential about human nature. We need sanctuary. We need privacy. We need space to be real. And when that space is denied to us, we create it anyway, in whatever form possible, with whatever resources we have, because the alternative, existing entirely on someone else's terms, is not really living at all. So here we are, at the end of our journey through hidden passages and secret boudoirs, through locked diaries and concealed coins, through forbidden books and forbidden love, through asylums and escapes, and finally into the light of public resistance. We have walked through these rooms together, you and I, opened these locked doors, read these private letters, witnessed these secret lives, and in doing so, maybe we have learned something about ourselves too, about our own hidden rooms, our own secrets, our own need for sanctuary. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening to these stories of women who lived in the shadows and the spaces between walls, for caring about their struggles and celebrating their resilience, for understanding that history is not just about famous people and major events, but also about ordinary people making extraordinary choices in impossible circumstances. The secret rooms of Victorian houses were never just architectural features. They were stories, they were lives, they were proof of the human spirit's refusal to be completely contained. As you go about your life now, when you see an old Victorian house with its elaborate facade and its promises of propriety, I hope you will wonder what secrets it holds, what hidden passages might run behind those walls, what stories are sealed away in forgotten rooms, and I hope you will remember the women who needed those spaces, who created them, who used them to survive and sometimes to thrive. Their rooms may be empty now, but their spirit, their determination, their refusal to be nothing more than what society demanded, that lives on. Until next time, my friends, until the next story calls us together, keep your own sanctuary, whatever form it takes. Keep your own secret space if you need one, but also keep working toward a world where everyone can live openly, safely, freely, where the need for hiding is replaced by the choice for privacy, where secret rooms become choices rather than necessities. Sweet dreams, and may you always have a door you can lock and the key in your own hand.